on live. Thank you very much for coming. We are at the last events of the ISMOR, but not the least, because it's a very, very nice tutorial we have today. We are very glad to guest such important and interesting tutorial, especially for the young generation of researchers. So thank you for coming. And just I want to tell that if you want to really to come in our town and so visit the south of Italy and Puglia, there is another occasion after ISMAR 21, which is virtual. It's called Summer School. And so if you are interested, I will post the link here in the chat. So I give the floor to Mark for the tutorial. Have a nice day. Thank you. Mark, you have the mic off. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. And it's good to see you all here. So my name is Mark Billinghurst, and to deal with Michael Niebling, we're going to present this tutorial on rapid prototyping for XR. I'm just going to share my slide, and then we can get started. Just go here. And okay, let's see. Oh, I'm showing the wrong screen. Sorry a minute. Let me just try that again. Great. So hopefully you can all see the slides. So as I said before, my name is Mark Billinghurst. I'm a professor at the University of South Australia and also the University of Auckland, and the director of the Empathic Computing Lab. And I've got a long history, nearly 25 years doing AR and VR research. Michael, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Hello, I'm Michael Niebling. I do research and teach at the University of Michigan, where I've been doing AR/VR for the past 5-6 years, and the focus has been on how to get these experiences prototyped quickly.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. So today we're going to have a 3.5 hour or so course. Initially, we'll talk a little bit about prototyping processes and fundamentals, and that'll mostly be done by Michael. And then I'm going to jump in and talk about lo-fi prototyping, and then later on he'll come back and talk about digital prototyping development tools and design guidelines and research questions. And I should make a note that these time zones here are set to the US time, so don't be surprised that we're starting at 2:30 in Italy, and you see 8:30 on the time zones here. So in this course, you'll learn an overview of different prototyping techniques for AR and VR, focusing mostly on a variety of low fidelity and high fidelity prototyping that you can do with almost no programming. You'll also talk a little bit about different types of authoring tools and some design guidelines and research directions. What we won't cover in depth is we won't talk a lot about the basic fundamentals of XR. We won't also talk about building hardware, and we don't talk about audio and haptics, and also go into much deeper about programming tools like Unity. So let me talk a little about the fundamentals. You know, in augmented and virtual reality, we see lots of fantastic interfaces like this. And so the question we're trying to address in this tutorial is, how do you prototype things like this? So one good example of that is the Google Glass. And the Google Glass is a wearable smart glasses. When you wear it, you can see in the peripheral of your display this type of heads-up view. In this case, it's a biking application, so you can see this little map view appearing. So Tom Chi, who was one of the initial developers on Google Glass, gave this really great presentation about prototyping. And in this presentation, he asked two questions. First of all, how long do you think it took to create the first version of Google Glass? And then how long did it take to prototype some of the user interactions with Google Glass? And so all I want to do is show his video. It's a little bit long, it's about 7 minutes long, but I think it gives us a really great fundamental idea about how important prototyping is. So let's watch the video.
My name is Tom Chi. I spent 2 years of my life building the user experience team for the Google X division of Google. And it's a place I affectionately called the Department of Science Fiction because of the futuristic nature of the types of projects we took on. Self-driving cars, Google Glass, and other things that you'll see soon enough. So for those who haven't heard of this project, this is what Google Glass looks like. It allows you to overlay digital things into your eyesight while still maintaining being part of a world. So if I were to pull out my cell phone and look into it, I'm basically out of this world now. Like I'm in my own little cell phone, tablet world, what have you. But Google Glass has the vision of allowing us to continue to be in the world, but also have access to the digital things that we need and we love. Now, I'm going to ask you a really simple question about Google Glass. How would you prototype this experience? How long do you think it would take you to make the first working version of a heads-up display? Okay, a little bit on the long side. The answer is 1 day. And here's what it looked like. So basically, the magic piece is the coat hanger. The coat hanger, I bent it in a specific shape, and the top loop goes around your neck, and then the bottom loop rests against your chest. And it allows me to carry a piece of plexiglass on which a little sheet protector. So these are the things that you put your book reports in so they don't get wet. I literally got it at the drugstore. Have it out at the end of the plexiglass, and then it gets projected onto with the Piker projector that's connected to a netbook. And using this setup, within 1 day, we were already able to start having the experience of what it looks like to have digital things overlaid on your physical world, be able to move around with it, and also use the netbook to try out tons and tons of different ideas around software. Now, after you start getting something like that working, a really important problem comes up. Like, you're wearing this thing on your head. It's like a pair of glasses. So you don't have a mouse or a keyboard or a touch screen, all the ways that you're used to interacting with a machine. So we thought for a second, well, maybe we could do something like what was shown in Minority Report. So for folks who haven't seen that, basically Tom Cruise is manipulating software with his hands in front of his face, and photos are flying over here, and his emails over here, and so on and so forth. So that's the same question again. How long do you think it would take to have the real experience of doing something like that? 2 years, okay. Somebody said 1 day. 45 minutes. So here's how it looks. So you wear the thing that we saw the first time because you need some way to go project things. But what happens is we got 2 hairbands, which I think was the hardest part. We had to go ask people for their hairbands. But you put one hand in each hairband, and attached to that hairband, we tied a fishing line. And the fishing line goes over the top of a whiteboard and then goes down to this little assembly that's taped to the floor. And what this means is every time I move my hand in any direction, it adds tension to the line, and it does the following with the assembly on the floor. So the other end of the fishing wire is attached to a chopstick. And it's not because I'm Asian. There's just a cafeteria nearby. I don't just carry chopsticks on me. But I tied it to the end of a chopstick. I clipped it into a binder clip and then put it over a pen. And basically what happens then is when you move your arm and it produces tension on the wire, chopstick comes down like a lever and clicks a presentation clicker. One hand moves the presentation forward, the other hand moves the presentation backwards. So this was built in 45 minutes, and that meant shortly afterwards, we were having experiences like looking at an image gallery and saying, next image, previous image, or looking at our emails and saying, let me click into this email, let me click reply now. And this was exactly the experience of what it was like to go control software with your hands. And ultimately, what it taught us is we probably shouldn't have this in the product. We learned a lot of things about the social awkwardness of it and some of the ergonomic aspects of it that you couldn't have figured out ahead of just thinking about it. And ergo, the second prototyping rule, which is doing is the best kind of thinking. They teach you to think a lot in school, but I think it's a little bit overrated. Now, last example, actually, Google's not the first team that's tried to go make something like this. If you search for heads-up display, you get tons of images of teams that have built various systems like this. But I can tell you at a glance that none of these pieces of hardware are comfortable to wear for more than 15 minutes, except for maybe the helmet over there. But then you got to wear a helmet. So how would you go figure out a way to go wear something like this comfortably? The answer is really basic materials. Modeling wire, paper, clay, and using something like this, I was able to make something that looked like a pair of glasses really quickly. I cut out pieces of clay that weighed exactly the same amount as the electronic components that we were talking about putting on the device, wrapped it in paper so you didn't get clay on your face, and then taped it to the modeling wire in various places to go experiment with how a pair of glasses could fit on you. And we discovered something really important then. Like, if you look at this drawing on the bottom, it turns out that the weight of a pair of glasses is actually mostly perceived through how much weight is on your nose. And it also turns out that your ears can carry a lot more weight than your nose, and that's a totally different experiment. You could ask me about that. But because of that fact, if you put weight behind your ears, it allows your ear to go act like the fulcrum of a lever, and it then takes weight off of your nose on the front. And actually, you guys can try this now. Anybody with glasses, if you push very gently on the back of your glasses, you'll find actually your glasses feel tremendously lighter. Now, this meant that we not only discovered something interesting about how to go, that's useful for developing a device like this, we actually discovered something pretty fundamental that had never been discovered about glasses, period. So if you have really heavy glasses, you can do this and you will be more comfortable. Now, the last point I want to make is about two types of learning, because through the process of rapid prototyping, you're able to learn very, very quickly. But it's a very specific type of learning. The type of learning that you usually learn in school, I call book learning. It comes from what humanity already knows, and it's a necessary foundation for you guys to go explore the world. But there's a totally different type of learning, which I call expansive learning. And this is the learning that you do on behalf of humanity, right? You are creating something new, you are expanding into the possibilities, and you're building that sphere of human knowledge in that process. And we think about these things, and as soon as you hear, like, okay, the infinite realm of possibilities beyond the sphere of human knowledge, you might be thinking, well, there's the scientists at the Large Hadron Collider and who have these amazing instruments. Like, that's their job, right? But the truth is that this action is available to all of us. It's not just for the scientists, it's also for the poet or the songwriter that expresses an emotion for the first time in a unique way. It's also for the person that has an amazing business idea that they're certain can help millions of lives. And it's the realm of using paper, clay, and tape in order to go find a new insight in an ancient technology. So now that you guys know a lot about rapid prototyping, I'm excited to see what you'll do with it. Thank you.
Okay, so that was kind of a long presentation, but in that presentation, he asked these two questions. He asked, how long will it take you to make the first working version of the glass headset display? And he said 1 day. And so there's a picture here of somebody wearing that pocket protector, that sheet protector you talked about, and the plexiglass holder. And then he had talked about interaction with glass and how long it would take to prototype that. And it was 45 minutes just to build this construction with these wires and headbands here. And this shows some of the early Google Glass prototypes. You can see the bike helmet with a sheet hanging off the front with a projector and some other head-worn devices. And so here's another early prototype of Google Glass. In this version, it was a backpack that weighed about 3 kilos with a mobile phone on your head and a small display. And then about a year and a half later, they had been able to shrink it down, to what ended up being in a very small head-worn display with only 40 grams. So this example shows really the importance of prototyping, and in particular the 3 rules of prototyping he talked about, where he says that you want to find the quickest path to experience, and that doing is the best kind of thinking, and you want to use materials that let you move at the speed of thought to maximize your rate of learning. So today we're going to be talking about these things. We're going to talk about how we can quickly prototype XR experiences, the type of materials we can use, and why it's important to rapidly prototype that. So I'm going to turn the time over now to Michael, and he will talk a little bit about the fundamentals of the XR prototyping process. Let me stop sharing here. I think, Michael, you can take over, can't you? Great, thanks so much. I'll be back in about 40 minutes. Yep, see you later.
All right. Cool, so I'll take over, and we're going to go through an example that is more focused on XR prototyping. but it is really following the same rules that Mark just established through the example from Tom Chi. So I want to show you an example where we prototype with a few Play-Doh materials and things like that. I mean, just like check one thing. I wanted to, before I share the sound, I don't want it to yell at you. And so I'm going to share the sound as well. So in fact, I'll actually just mute this. You see an example of us prototyping, recreating scenes from the Lion King remake, which was, it's an interesting use case or an interesting case study because the Lion King movie from 2019 was actually completely done in virtual reality. And we, in a lot of the courses I teach and a lot of the research projects I do, we use physical prototyping as a very rapid way to move at the speed of thought. So I wanted to show you this part. Let me just go back 1 second. This part we need the sound, otherwise you won't believe me. So, okay. Okay, so this was the $25 version of the $250 million version on the bottom right. And obviously, we're not Disney, but this recreating this teaser, elements from the teaser with physical prototyping was also a matter of just 2 hours and a little bit of fun. And but more fundamentally, what did we actually learn from prototyping that way? That I find that is very interesting, and that's something we will focus on. But I also want to show you how we actually took it further using XR techniques. So I told you the movie Lion King was actually done in virtual reality. So I'll show you an example. This is coming from a research project where we built a new system to allow multiple designers to collaborate in AR and in VR. And you will see one of our examples where we recreate or experiment at least with the portion of the movie or the scene where Rafiki, the monkey, walks up Pride Rock. And so we have 3 roles in this prototyping experience. We have me as the director. We have Jane, who is going to be Rafiki, the actor, and she's going to be in virtual reality. Then we have a camera, which is Katie, in this case, using a phone, so using augmented reality. And so together we prototype this experience in this example. Action. And you can see very good acting here on Jane's behalf, who is walking up. I'll show you what the scene looks like in a second. You can see it a little bit on the screen in the background. And so I cut and interrupt and I give instructions on how to move the camera. And so Jane's acting was obviously brilliant. But the scene actually then looks like, let me see, 1 second. The scene that I saw, which allowed me to comment and give feedback, looked more like this. So we have Katie, who is moving this camera in augmented reality. And we have Jane, who, by moving her body, and there could be other ways to actually indicate the movement, she's actually walking up Pride Rock. And we did this a few times, and we repositioned and experimented until we kind of like got the shot that was relatively close to the movie. And I mean, using assets that obviously not necessarily the quality of what Disney had. But the interesting thing of using these techniques that fall into the realm of virtual production is that you don't actually have to record any images at this point. All you record is what happens in virtual reality, the traces of the characters, the traces of the camera, any kind of factors on the camera, and they can all be adjusted and changed in post-processing. So you can be quick and dirty as you prototype these experiences, and you have actually everything recorded in a nice way so that you can actually adjust it later. I wanted to start with this example because it is, this way of immersive authoring that we just saw. So immersive authoring means you are inside AR or VR as you are designing, and at the same time also experiencing your design. This is one of the steps you can actually do relatively early. However, in prototyping XR experiences, I think we would still start on paper. So normally, also in this project, but in any project I do, we conceptualize the XR experience on paper. So the paper didn't go away. So you would see kind of like a storyboard like this, which in this case, we were recreating elements from the teaser. Obviously, it wasn't brainstorming a new idea, but I'll show you examples later where we brainstorm new ideas. So you do the storyboarding part, which is really producing a sequence of frames and understanding how the user, in this case, the viewer, would go through the experience and perceive things. And you add increasing detail to this to make it wireframe. So we talk about wireframing as well a little bit. And there are actually interesting techniques to storyboard and prototype using principles of 360 photos that I want to share with you today. So it's not just going to be flat on paper. And then we would normally do a form of physical prototyping. In this case, I really wanted to play around with Play-Doh. And in my research, I've developed a few techniques to really bring these Play-Doh figures into AR and VR experiences through not necessarily photogrammetry, which would be a more advanced technique, but doesn't always work well with small objects. We used more lightweight techniques, but similar principles. So you, in some sense, scan the Play-Doh characters and create clones of them in AR and in VR from these, but only from the perspectives that you captured, which is often sufficient for prototyping. So we don't do full reconstruction. But you could imagine, and we are increasingly doing this in my courses now, where you just use relatively good 3D scanning software on your iPhone or on your iPad, which allows you to go around some of these models and capture them in 3D. And you saw a lot of our little Play-Doh figures, and we used a lot of cardboard. So the cool thing about physical prototyping is you can be very, very quick and flexible. Some of these models definitely have a lot of detail, and but everything you see here was done within 2 hours, including the filming. And so what we removed from the 2 hours was we didn't have to come up with the idea of what we wanted to prototype, since we were essentially recreating the trailer or the teaser, but we had to be creative with how we prototype and where do we add detail and where do we leave details out. And that's an intuition that you have to develop and will develop the more you prototype. You would then take the physical prototype into the digital world. And for that, you have a lot of options, which we'll also cover today. There's a lot of tools to support digital prototyping. Some of them can be used in immersive prototyping and authoring. So you would be in AR or VR directly, but there's also a lot of tools that you would just use on a screen and then on a computer, and then maybe preview if you connect a headset or deploy to your phone. And so we want to go through a range of tools and techniques, including video prototyping, which means you do not actually really implement anything. You simulate a lot of the interactions, which is actually very powerful for designers who may not have so much programming experience or who don't actually want to program too much. And we also cover things like Unity, which is one of the main tools, and Unreal, where you can actually author quite a bit, create nice landscapes and virtual environments. The hard part will be implementing the interactions. And for that, there are various toolkits. And I also will provide an overview of some of the toolkits. So this is the final experience without the sound, but kind of like how it was shot in our tool. And in this case, actually scripted. So I have to be clear. So this was the version that we implemented through digital prototyping. Here, we used a tool called A-Frame, which is web-based, and it's good for people who have experience using web technologies. This particular scene here that we just saw was actually done in Unity. Where actually this was the A-Frame version. We had also a version in Unity. The Unity version took a new student who hasn't actually used Unity before, took 9 hours, so that was additional extra work. So the digital prototype really took significantly more time than the 2 hours of physical prototyping. And one thing I will say, even though I don't want to be too negative, is the fidelity compared to the physical prototype with this digital prototype hasn't actually increased much. The main benefit is that we can now experience these things in VR. I'll show you a 2D version here, but we could see all this in VR or even in AR, since A-Frame is WebXR enabled and capable. So we can actually do this on a variety of devices. So this is the prototyping workflow in a nutshell. And so I never know exactly who's in the audience. You could all be doing AR VR for 20 years or 25 years like Mark. And then maybe you're like, oh, okay, Michael, we do this all the time. So in this case, maybe it's just cool that we are on the same page in some sense. And then there are some of you who came here today to learn how to do this really from the start. And I like this analogy to filmmaking. When I think about XR design, it's helpful for me to think about filmmaking. So filmmaking, even though not many of us have actually done our own movies, maybe we have recorded something and shared it on Instagram or whatnot, or YouTube. Filmmaking is actually really an interesting process with a lot of different roles, where you have a director, obviously, who more or less is like the manager, doesn't actually operate the camera. For that, we have the director of photography or cinematography. The cinematographer would actually essentially figure out how to move the camera and how to actually do things. So we have actors, obviously, in the movies, and the better paid they are and the more celebrity they are, the more successful the movie experience is, at least in some cases. But the actors are not everything. We actually have a mix of people who work on the lighting, very, very important, sound, and then special effects, which is probably the one thing that we talk about when you come back from the movies is maybe it was good acting, but most of the time it was really how well the movie was done and the special effects. So in XR, it's very interesting. So the director, that is actually you, if you are the XR designer or developer. Now the director of photography, the person actually controlling the camera, is not you. That is actually the user. And that is one of the main challenges, that you actually have to kind of steer them in a way where they have agency. And that is a main difference to filmmaking. And so you want to make sure, as a director, you can be sure, and there are always these glitches in movies, like maybe in Mandalorian, maybe you saw this little fun thing where somebody was just standing in their jeans behind a door, and that was actually ended up in the Mandalorian movie or the series, and there were lots of jokes about it on social media. And these things always happen, that somebody forgets to not be in the camera or something. And that's very difficult and very tricky. So for XR, it's really like, how do the user can actually do everything they want. So how do I actually get them to do what I want? And so this actually has to do with storytelling and visual cues and auditory cues to really get the user to go and explore things that you want them to explore. So you have to drive the experience, but you do not have full control. You cannot actually move them. If you did move them while they're in AR or VR, they have a very high chance of getting very sick. The user has to stay in control. And that is actually something that is very hard. And we'll talk a little bit about guidelines as well today. Finally, obviously the actors is very interesting. So depends how you think about it. And I've done experiences where we've actually at the University of Michigan, where actually in filmmaking, we have a department of media, television, and TV, where they actually had actors act out XR scenes and record it. So they were using motion capture actors, and that's something that is done, for example, in The Lion King, not necessarily in the prototypes I create. The prototypes I create and many of my students create, the XR designer composes the scenes and actually creates the scenes. And we may work with a 3D artist, or we may just use existing 3D models, or we may give it a try ourselves. Personally, for me, 3D modeling is still something that is very fascinating to me, but not something that I feel I'm very good at or experienced. I can do the Play-Doh things, or paper prototyping, or any form of physical prototyping, and actually can be quite creative, and I like that. And then I think the next thing where I feel like confident is when it comes to programming and implementation. But 3D content creation, so the actual modeling, is actually really an important part of the job. And that's why, for example, in a lot of my projects, I work with students who have an architecture background. They are usually very well trained in these tools. And then finally, it's interesting, the remaining roles still fall onto the lap of the XR designer. And at some stage, maybe when it comes to special effects, maybe you will need scripting, and maybe I would draw the line and then say, okay, this is something where we need really somebody who can develop and implement. Although you can do a lot of special effects in Unity, for example, through the animation pipeline. And Unreal, you also have various things, and there are particle effects and all these kinds of things. So we won't go over every special aspect, but I always think it's interesting to think about how XR experiences are created and how it's actually not too different from filmmaking. We have all these roles, but often they are actually inhibited by one person, the developer. So I think we should also distinguish basic XR experiences and then more advanced XR experiences. So if you just look at basic experiences for a second, a lot of if your first AR or VR experience is probably looking at a model in 3D, and then maybe we'll have a little bit of light, and this can be done in AR or in VR. And then most people would, if they see it for the first time, they would be excited and they would call it, wow, this is XR. But if you think about how an actual more complex XR experience is created, you have light, you have not just basic, but some kind of custom 3D model landscape, really a lot of things going on, not just one model. At least something more custom, but more like an environment. And then you have sound, animations, light, and a lot of things to really bring this experience to life. And so that would mean that you need to inhabit all these roles. And that's why I think it's interesting. So an XR experience, more generally, I want to be a little bit more conceptual and to think it through before I give you more examples. So if you zoom out, what is actually involved? And then maybe your backgrounds are more in web and mobile design and development, or you already have experience in XR. I think it helps to think about the three main elements that I think I see in most XR experiences. This is the environment, and it's very interesting. So you think about, is it physical? So is it existing? And am I designing an AR experience, or is it virtual? Do I have to create the environment? And that makes a big difference. And it's interesting to think about which, is it harder to prototype AR experiences, or is it harder to prototype VR experiences? And I think I would say it depends on whether you are in the environment that you are designing for or not, when it comes to AR, and whether you have access to all the things you need to, so that you don't have to simulate a lot of the environment. But otherwise, it can actually be very similar, prototyping AR and VR experiences. You have 3D characters, which are the avatars and the 3D models, and obviously some form of, let's say, data in there. Data here can mean a lot of things, including, for example, their movement. But then animations and things like that. We have interactions which can be explicit and implicit. I think it's very important that you don't just think of gesture and speech like the Minority Report examples that Mark talked about. A lot of interaction in XR is actually implicit. So there's just things going on, just like in real life. You have, for example, people moving or objects blinking, animations and stuff like that. Sometimes these are triggered more implicitly by the user gazing or walking towards a certain direction or entering some kind of zone. Still relatively implicit. And then there's obviously a rich set of explicit interactions when the user is actually using gesture or speech commands to activate objects. So I would distinguish at the highest level the content and then obviously the interactions. And it's also very important to think about the main elements of XR experiences, which to me is context and story. And context is really established both through the existing physical world, independent of whether you're creating AR or VR, there's always a physical world where you experience it. And if that physical world is very different from the virtual world, for example, in VR, you have lots of problems. So you need to align them and you need to deal with that. And so I will expand on this notion of context in a second. And then the story, which is not just like in The Lion King, like the movie story and the script, the movie script in some sense. I think of story more like the user story, how the user will experience this XR creation. What kinds of interactions will be available to them? How do they interact with the characters? How are they themselves actually represented in the XR experience? So this is all part of the story. And so now we have established these main concepts, context and story. It's very interesting to think about the differences between AR and VR. So in VR, you design the VR environment and you kind of like have to make it fit into the real world. And so in some sense, I mean, it's not true that the VR world is smaller than the reality. In most cases, VR environments are vast, but the main thing is you have to design this VR experience and somehow has to fit into the reality of the user so that the user doesn't get injured when they actually walk through the experience and work, experience it. And so in VR context drives the VR experience, really limits it, or you can have a very nice experience if you have a lot of physical space. And in AR, you design the environment, obviously, but you actually need to blend it with reality. So most AR experiences I know are very primitive. They just overlay something and don't even care about the environment. And that has to do with some of the technology limitations that a lot of devices don't sense the environment very well. Maybe the HoloLens 2 is an example I'll show you later, where we can actually do a lot with spatial mapping. But you still have to adapt actually the content. So in AR, I think it's very interesting to think about this interplay. And you are not just designing the virtual content and then place it into this world. You are designing the entire experience. And that means even though you do not have the control over where the AI experience takes place, you have to design for the blend of these two. And I think that is one of the main challenges. And it was one of the reasons why I don't think that we have seen a lot of AR experiences that are actually very well done, because most of them are just like that. You take some 3D content and place it in whatever world the user is in, and then actually design for this blend, which I think is very, very important. And so on the story side, the story is really, in VR, it's really at the intersection of the real and the virtual. And the best story and the best experiences I've had was when we actually had a very good alignment of the physical world and what happens in the story. So for example, if you have to press the buttons in your VR experience, the ones that I have experienced, Disney's The Void was one of their kind of like accelerator projects. The Void is not actually from Disney, but cooperated with Disney and actually now was discontinued. But they was in this what they call a hyper reality experience, where it was a Star Wars and the Marvel experience. So where we actually had to go through kind of like a starship. So there were little walls that we could touch. And I remember password entry. And for password entry, I actually had there was a physical control pad nicely aligned with the virtual environment. And so that is actually really telling the story at the intersection of the real and the virtual. Most of the time we do mid-air interactions. If you download, for example, on your Quest, if you have one, you download the Star Wars experiences, Vader Immortal or something like that. Everything happens mid-air. There's no haptic feedback. There's no alignment with the physical world. And so while it is still very powerful, as a story and really nicely illustrated and done, something is really missing because they don't really tell the story at the intersection of the real world. It's very hard because users have whatever real world, and the main challenge of the future AR/VR experience is actually making better use of the user's environment and to adapt to the user's environment. And in AR, you tell the story as the union. As is interesting now, mathematically, it's interesting. It actually means a lot more. In some sense, it's much more challenging. So a draw, you don't just do the AR thing and fit it in there. You really have to design for this blend, as I said. And so the story really needs to unfold at the union of the reality and the augmented reality. If you don't achieve that, it's really not a good experience. And so this sets our larger goal for where we want to be at the end. Prototyping, the prototyping techniques we introduced you today will get you maybe halfway there. And then I'll talk about the development in the last block today, where we can explore how we can actually get closer to this telling stories at the intersection and the union, because for that we really need more advanced hardware and also software to really adapt to the user's environment. At the end of this block, at the end of this tutorial, we'll also talk about some research directions. So this was an overview based on the Lion King example. And for the next 20 minutes, and that's when Mark will come back in 20 minutes. He's currently at a panel discussion at ISMAR. And then we'll do a little handover. So in the next 20 minutes, I'll talk to you more through the XR process. I think it's very important that we put things in perspective. First, I could have walked through all the techniques and then we put it together, but let's try it this way first. So traditionally, interaction design is really an iterative process along requirements gathering and alternative designs. Very important that you don't just like have one idea and prototype that to even if it means the death of you. So no, it's important that you explore alternative designs. And so a lot of the techniques we introduced today to you today are about prototyping quickly, and so that you can actually throw away things and not feel too sad. If you implemented 1 or 2 prototypes in Unity, it'll take you really quite a bit of time, and you are less likely to make changes to them and to radically explore different design directions just because of the effort you had to put in. So a lot of the techniques emphasize the quick and dirty and the fast. We do want to achieve interactive prototypes and so that we can actually test them with users. But the interactive prototypes testing with users can also be done with paper and physical prototypes. It's something I want to share with you. And then, yeah, you actually do evaluate with users. So the interaction design process really, in a lot of projects, at least in the courses that I teach and in the research projects that I do, a lot of the challenges are actually in the framing the problem part. So when is actually AR or VR a good tool for the problem? And that is actually something that is a little bit out of scope of this tutorial, but it's definitely something I teach a lot about, and brainstorming techniques and ideation techniques. And I'm never happy. I'm always looking for better techniques, but okay. The things that we want to focus on is really exploring the solution space. So that would be really creating alternative designs, diverging. And then at some stage, maybe through input from the client or the user, or other designers and experts, we converge towards a solution. So we create choices and then we make choices. We iterate on them throughout the process. And we finally refine choices as we implement the solution, which and then refining a solution is fine if you can stay within the same tool. But as you will also learn today, creating XR experiences is not just like, okay, I'll do everything in Unity. A lot of people actually do that, and I don't think I'm not a big fan. I think for me it's very important to have an overview of the right tools. So for example, if I had to prototype a better ISMAR tutorial experience for you, I wouldn't actually go there in Unity and prototype it in there. I would actually use a technique that I'll introduce to you later, which I call piggyback prototyping, or others have called piggyback prototyping. I would use an existing tool, actually a social VR tool like Altspace or Rec Room or Mozilla Hubs, and actually create then give me the networking and the ability to have multiple people experience that immediately. I actually have access to user base as well, since there are many Altspace users. And then I could actually prototype that way. If I did it in Unity, I can probably create a really nice user interface, but it's very hard for me to actually make it multi-user. And so I think, and while there are tools within Unity, I'm not saying you can't do multi-user and networking and all that. I just think the deployment and getting access to test users would be pretty hard in that case. And so I just want us to be clear. It's not just about Unity and Unreal. So the XR process is really a sequence of 4 steps. That's how I think about it. Yes, Laura. And I think I'll come back to the Mozilla Hubs example. And in fact, the reason I have to leave it in about 20 minutes is and Mark will take over, is I'm going to my students' presentations. And one of my students was creating a VR karaoke experience. And it was really fun with a lot of music and lights, but actually a very social experience. And I said to that student, please use Mozilla Hubs and give it a try. And he will actually show that to me later. So I may come back as a very happy person, having experienced some of the latest XR prototypes currently being created in my class at University of Michigan. So the XR process if you are a designer, Laura, for example, I do think this will resonate a lot with you. The need finding and brainstorming processes where we actually really, as designers, we want to get this right. So we want to talk a lot to users and figure that out. In the XR world, is actually most people don't actually have a problem with XR experience. First of all, we don't actually have a lot of users of XR experiences, so it's very so traditional methods of inquiry are actually quite difficult. So I will say this is also a little bit out of focus, out of scope of this tutorial. But when I teach and do research, a lot of the techniques I focused on is actually how do we get people to imagine an XR experience. So if, let's say, you wanted to do a study with high school teachers, which is something we did recently, how do I get them to imagine use cases of AR and actually maybe consider even that they would use it in their teaching, even though they have been teaching for 30 years and they never needed AR. So the problem was not that AR wasn't good enough or wasn't available. There's just no need. And so how do you actually find a need? And so what we did was actually using prototyping and creating lots of little example experiences for them. So we created interactive paper handouts in AR that would pop out elements and allow students to explore things in context and out of paper and work with paper, but paper was still central to the interaction. And from an AR perspective, it's just marker-based AR. The most boring thing you could do, that would what ISMAR attendees will tell you. But and that's not true. I'm a little cynical here. But for a teacher, it actually was eye-opening. And so the need finding and brainstorming is where actually our prototypes can play a role. So don't think of it as like we don't do any prototyping within need finding. I think actually, to do need finding and really work with clients, the second step that I highlight here, the storyboarding and prototyping, so it's not necessarily that sequential, is actually very key to need finding and brainstorming. So I always do these in iterations together, not just like waterfall 1, 2, and then 3. But 3, the most important thing about this slide is also that 3 is not the first thing. So you don't just jump into, oh, is it WebXR today, Unity or Unreal? Which one should I use? You do these other steps before. And then finally, we shouldn't forget, and not a lot of us have experience with this, actually deploying something with real users and studying how they use it and maybe improve it, and what data can we actually collect in XR and what data should we collect in XR. So this then raises a lot of things I also really care a lot about, which is ethics, privacy, security, and safety. And that is also a little bit out of scope for this tutorial, but you can tell I'm passionate about a lot of things around the XR process. And in fact, the research, and I'll show some examples from ISMA this year as well, actually really highlights that this XR process still needs a lot of work. So on the prototyping side, okay, so reiterating essentially what we saw for the Lion King, okay, we do storyboarding, physical and digital prototyping, and we want to get through some of the tools. So a concept I wanted to introduce to you, but many of you who have a design background will be familiar with this, is fidelity. So fidelity, maybe one way to look at it is like, let's say how close, if whatever the final thing is that I want to create, the higher the fidelity, the closer I am to that. The lower the fidelity, the further away I am from that, the more imagination the user or the designer actually has to use. And so what are the techniques? The techniques we introduce you to, and I just go through in this block, is paper prototyping, using dioramas, so more physical prototyping, 360, and then finally 3D. And then from 3D to VR and AR is just a small jump, but from paper to VR and AR is usually quite a big jump, but not with the techniques I'll actually walk through in the next few minutes. So from an experience and skill perspective, when you are a designer, and I'm not saying that designers cannot program. Actually, many designers could do programming and scripting very well. They may not enjoy it, and they may prefer to think through things differently and express themselves differently. And so it's very important. In a lot of my own research, I've looked at how to enable more designers and novice XR creators, not just the developers. But still, if you look at traditional tools and the ones that exist outside of research, paper and physical prototyping, like in a diorama where you create like a little model of the XR stage that you want to deliver in the end. All that is relatively simple and easy, at least for people with creative backgrounds. Maybe a developer, a hardcore developer, would find that the hard part. It's very funny to me how difficult sketching actually is. Unless you are a designer and you're really good at this. And so a lot of my computer science students actually really struggle with this part. We'll probably draw the curve the other way around, because then doing the VR and the AR part is then relatively easy and familiar to them. The main difference is the 3D environment, and that is actually a hard part. So something that I wanted to say now, and you see it a few times throughout. So prototyping is also about choosing the resolution, and resolution is here not full HD or just HD ready or something. No, the resolution is the amount of detail you want to put into your experience. So a lot of the time we start with very simple scene planning, kind of like I would do it at a movie set. And then I start to decorate the stage and the scene a little bit more. So I use more polished content. So I bring in 3D models, maybe that somebody creates for me, or that we captured ourselves, or that we modeled ourselves. And then comes the really hard part, which is the interactions. And the interactions is something where I would, again, distinguish implicit and explicit interactions. So here we have an example of a more explicit interaction. A user is, for example, targeting this object using, let's say, cardboard, and then if they gaze and fuse on this object, it would trigger a click. And this can also be an example of an implicit interaction where the user is just looking at something, and we give it a little bit of a dwell time before we actually maybe adjust the object in some sense. It wasn't particularly exciting, the animation I just did, but it's just very interesting to think about this. So these interactions, they often are implemented very similarly. Gaze-based, for example, can actually be a lot of implicit. And so you would use timeouts and other things to distinguish them from what the user actually wants to do. So, but in any case, that's how we do it. And then implementation-wise, really, the way I think about the process is the thing I want to reach as quickly as I can is the MVP, the minimum viable product. And the way I think of it is that's not the thing I deliver to the client. That's the thing I can use for user testing. So how do I get to user testing before I deliver something which is maybe a spec, or I would continue and actually implement the whole thing. But so we often create different versions. And I think it's very interesting when it comes to prototypes. The interactions are really often the hard parts, the difficult things to do, and often requires switching between tools. So in the early stages of the design concept, when I do the problem framing, I think about, is AR or VR actually a good solution? Should it be XR? So should the user be able to choose modality, or does it have to be VR specifically, for example? And then thinking through some of the basic and more advanced interactions. that I can actually then get to user testing and finally reflect on the things I've learned from a prototype. So so prototyping is a lot of fun. And when I show the physical prototypes, for example, I always get very excited seeing Play-Doh and students thinking through the experience and moving things around. But it's very important that you actually reflect on what you've learned about the problem and not the method. So initially, when I teach my course, students reflect a lot on the difficulties of prototyping, but it's a distraction because it is actually designed to be easy, and you should be thinking about what you learn about the problem through prototyping and do a lot of iterations throughout. So finally, when it comes to developing and testing, that's something we'll talk in more detail about when I come back. We have a choice of things we can choose between all these different tools. WebXR is something I often do, reaches a lot of people, mostly AR experiences on the smartphone. You can also do VR on certain headsets, but then actually on Oculus is actually really quite well done on the Oculus Quest. Unity and Unreal is probably the main tools and platforms, very popular for AR and VR. Traditionally game engines, but have matured into tools that can be used and are very popular for AR VR creation. You can also target a specific platform, like creating an iOS application for mobile, for Apple iPhones or iPads, and then targeting specific ARKit support, for example, or working directly with the Oculus SDK. And they are actually, the way I think about Unity and Unreal, these to me are more cross-platform approaches. First of all these different vendors integrate with Unity and also increasing WebXR. But the way we develop, so for example, through AR Foundation, which is like an abstraction from both ARKit and ARCore, is actually very powerful, because while there are within each of these platforms for Apple and for Google Android, it actually abstracts away nicely from some of the differences. And I just create one AR experience, and I do not have to deal with the specific issues relevant to each of the native platforms. However, I may not have access to the latest features of ARKit and ARCore, so some face tracking might be limited, or for example, occlusion detection and rendering is something that wasn't previously possible with AR Foundation. Maybe it is now, but I would have to use ARKit directly. So thinking about deployment and analytics, so we won't talk too much about this, but these prototypes are nice, but ultimately you want to learn more long-term about how users interact with your XR experiences. And so a lot of the things I've done in the past and working with clients, we often develop custom logging systems and log analysis. And then I looked a little bit into research, how we could actually create maybe a platform for user testing in mixed reality. There are existing tools, analytics tools. They are very focused on how many users actually download your stuff and maybe how far they click in some of your experiences, but they're not actually very interesting from an XR analytics perspective. So and something a little bit out of scope of the tutorial, but still very interesting to me, is there are more and more dedicated XR analytics tools. So often creating heat maps of how users interact with the XR content, and that can be useful. It generates a lot of data, so you have to think about what's the best way to actually make use of that data and actually get that. Use it to your advantage. So for the remaining tutorial, when Mark will come back soon, we'll walk through some of these low fidelity prototyping techniques. So on the low fidelity side here, maybe a little easier to do. We'll walk through those. And then we actually also talk about digital authoring, immersive authoring, and then some of the more technical development approaches that often then require scripting or 3D modeling and 3D programming skills. So, but this is an overview of all the techniques we'll cover. And I'll start a little bit on the paper prototyping side, and then Mark will come and take over. So in one way to think about prototyping tools is not just, I think we said it a few times now, not just the digital tools, but actually start with maybe on paper and then maybe take it into video prototyping. And so these are some of the things we'll talk about in the next block. It is very interesting to think about the advantages and disadvantages of lo-fi and hi-fi prototyping. So the main advantage of lo-fi prototyping is it's quick, it's easy, it's cheap, easier for you to discard ideas because you haven't actually implemented too much and spent too much time on them, and maybe are not even as attached to them. High fidelity prototyping, yeah, you can be fully interactive, you can give it into users' hands, they can experience it in XR. Very expensive to develop though, time consuming to build, and then most importantly, developers or actually any kind of user and client are reluctant to suggest changes, especially developers are reluctant to implement changes because of how much time it already took to create those things. So these high fidelity prototypes is something you would want to do after lo-fi prototypes. There's a lot of usefulness to lo-fi prototyping. Obviously, the lo-fi prototypes are limited, so working with a Play-Doh model or paper prototype is obviously a little bit limited compared to a Unity experience. So I'm going to see Mark might still be in his panel, so we'll see whether he's connecting back, I think, Mark. Or he may not. He may be in his panel. So I'll keep going a little bit longer, and then I may give you a short break to check on my class. So unfortunately, we didn't have full control over when this tutorial is, and so I still have to teach today at the University of Michigan. So I'll just fly from Italy back. No, I'm actually not in Italy. I'm actually in the US right now. So yeah, let us. Okay. So I feel like I kind of need to hand off soon. So let me check of how much progress I made. I think this is where I wanted to be. And this is the part where Mark wanted to jump in and show us a few more things. And so I think and I know we have a scheduled break of 30 minutes, but I'm thinking it would be great if Mark is going to be here, so Mark can actually take over.
I'm here, Michael. So
good timing, Mark. So I made it to this point where it says, let's look at it in more detail. So that's slide 70. And I think it is the next things that you wanted to talk about are actually also the slides that you prepared. They do include some of my examples. But either feel free to skip them or to show them, and I got to run to my class for a bit, okay?
Okay, I'll see you back in a couple of hours, I guess. Is it an hour, or how long will you be gone for?
Yeah, it is actually, because there is a scheduled break, it is actually, so now it's 1.5 hours that I would be gone.
Great, good. We'll see you back later then.
Thank you, Mark. And it's nice, we have some, there is a way for our participants to chat with us, and Laura left a comment earlier, and it's actually really nice to hear a little bit about the background of our participants. So would also, when I come back later, maybe we can do I can read some of the introductions or something. Although when I'm gone, I won't be able to see the messages. But anyway, I would encourage you to ask questions throughout. Since we cannot see you, it's relatively lonely. But thanks so far for your attention, and have fun, Mark. I'll see you later.
Great, thanks a lot. So as Michael reminded me, I've got a chat channel open here. So if you want to ask any questions, please ask in chat, and we'll keep on going. So he would have given you a basic overview of the prototyping process, and I want to delve in a bit more detail. And in particular, I'm going to start talking about some low fidelity prototyping tools that mostly revolve around tools you can use without doing any programming. So we're going to talk about going from sketching through to wireframes and mock-ups, and then to prototypes. And this is a typical process that you go through in the XR development process. And for most of these steps, you don't need to do any programming at all, and we'll show you some tools you can use to be able to develop with that. So in many ways, the most valuable prototyping tool you can have is a pencil and paper. And that's because these allow you to sketch. And sketching is really more about communication and the activity of getting ideas out of your head and onto paper than about the result. In the video I showed you at the beginning, we had Tom Chi talking about using tools that can move at the speed of thought, and certainly sketching is one of those tools. So it's not about drawing, but it's about the design. And sketching as a tool can really help you express yourself, communicate your design ideas, and also further develop those ideas. Once you start sketching ideas on paper and you know the ideas go from your mind onto a physical representation, then you'll find that it becomes easier to communicate with somebody else. But also, when you see those ideas down on paper, you'll think of ways to improve and change them as well. So sketching is really part of a process. It's part of the process of idea generation, design elaboration and changing and making design choices, and finally engineering those choices. So Bill Buxton wrote a couple of really great books about sketching. This one, Sketching User Experience, and the one on the right, Sketching User Experience, the Workbook. And these books talk all about how important sketching is for the user experience and how to use sketching as part of the prototyping process. And as part of these books, he talked about these 5 key attributes that sketches have. So first of all, as I said before, you can work at the speed of thought and you can sketch very, very quickly. Secondly, you know, almost everybody has a pen and paper that's at hand and readily available. So that means that you can always put your ideas down on paper. It's very inexpensive and doesn't involve much investment in time or training, so it's very disposable. You know, paper and pencil, it means it's very easy to iterate on the design ideas and you can change them very quickly. And then finally, sketching is really a catalyst. And once you've got something on paper, you can show it to somebody else and say, hey, what do you think of this idea? Or can you help me make this better? And so it becomes a mechanism for starting communication. So here's a couple of examples of quick AR/VR interface design sketches. You can see the one on the right is kind of a cylindrical user interface that has concentric circles of information. Then you've got on the left a very rough sketch of some sort of outdoor interface where you've got the mountains or something's appearing. So you can see, of course, these are very, very crude, but you don't need to have very much detail to be able to get ideas down on paper. Here's another example of how you can combine a rough sketch into something else. So you can see on the left-hand side some sketches that were made maybe on a napkin or something, and the top one shows a user interface for a augmented or a smart glass running aid. So as the person's running, you want to be able to see the steps they've been running and have a little bit of history as well. So on the left-hand side is the concept, and on the right-hand side, this is more fully fleshed out into PowerPoint or Photoshop or some other design tool. And on the bottom, you can see a similar thing. This time though, this is a tool where you can, an augmented reality tool where you can look around and you can align a horizon line with some mountains. And then that lets you tag the mountains around you and give you their names and heights. So again, you can see on the left, very rough sketch, and on the right-hand side, a more fully featured interface. So sometimes sketch concepts are like this, where they look very beautiful and they're well designed, but other times they're just a few lines on paper. You can also do things, especially with augmented reality. You can take photographs of the real world, and then you can actually sketch on top of the photographs to show what it might look like to have an augmented reality interface. So you can see on the left-hand side some sort of IoT interface where you can look at this piece of wood and you can see a green virtual annotation appearing, showing some other information. On the right-hand side, some sort of, it's like a chemistry reminder note that appears on the wall. So one nice way of sketching an augmented reality is to take photographs of real workplaces where you want to have that user interface, and then sketch on those photographs and show what it might look in the AR view. There's some really great tools though also for sketching VR interfaces. In particular, you can download these types of panorama template grids. And then once you've downloaded them, you can sketch on the grids here, and you can then view that inside a 360 photo viewer for a VR headset. So if you've got sharp eyes, you'll see these grids have lines that show the correct perspective for 360. So it makes it very easy to draw the objects in space correctly. So here's another example of how you can use that to create a little storyboard. And in this concept sheet, you can see it conveys 2 points of view. The bottom one is the egocentric first-person view, and then the top one is the exocentric top-down view. So this one allows you also to think about different regions of the interface. So you can see the top-down view allows you to show you the field of view of the person, and you can see that white area is the center of the field of view, shows what will always be in view, and then you've got some gray areas that show the periphery and the above and below field of view. So using this, you can sketch directly onto that, and you can start putting ideas about what you want to have the person always see in their view as opposed to what's in their surroundings. So this gives you an example of one of those templates. You can see the white part here, like I said before, is what's in the center of the field of view, and then you've got the light gray parts that show what's to your side, and the dark gray parts is what's behind you. And then similarly, the dark gray parts above and below show what's up and down. So with this type of template, you can sketch into this and then build a user interface that when you view it inside a VR headset, it looks like a real 360 user interface. So here's an example of that. So they've taken that template and they've sketched out, this looks like it's a virtual lecture theatre. So you can see on the right-hand side, a whole bunch of people sitting in the audience. There's a person lecturing on the middle, and on the left-hand side, there's a whiteboard with some sort of squiggles drawn on it. So this is what you draw in the real world. And then once you've drawn that image, you can scan it and you can bring it into a 360-degree photo viewer on your VR headset. And you'll get something that looks like this. So you can see the person now is panning around. And if you're viewing this in a VR headset, you really do feel immersed in that space. So this is a really simple way to start sketching out some VR environments and some user interface ideas that you can then put in headset and view to see what you think about them in VR. So this is with sketching, but you can also use 360 photographs to take that same effect. So this is a simple Ricoh Theta camera. You can take a picture of that, and then again you can view that picture inside the VR interface. And so you can also layer on top of those pictures to create different depth layers. So this is a paper that Michael published at CHI 2 years ago. And in this case, you've got some interface objects that you want to be in front of others, and then some that you want to be in the background, and some that are, again, attached to your center of your field of view or the surroundings. So you can see here he's created some layers. So there's the dog and the car, for example, is in the front, and then you've got another layer behind that of these trees and railing, and then you've got a third layer in the background of the mountains. And so when you can physically create these layers by putting pieces of paper together, but when you view them in a headset, you really do get that 3D effect of having multiple layers of information. So you can see again this layer together, you put it into the 360, and then you can see this different view there. So this video is going to show you what that looks like when it's viewed inside a 360 display. Seems like it's taking a... Let me just go back and see if I can reload that. Okay. Okay, so now you can see him panning around, and you'll see that because of the layers of information, you can see the dog there, for example, looks like it's more closer to the front, and similarly that the butterflies and the trees are in a separate layer as well. So that really creates that sense of depth, which you won't get from just a 360 photograph. So this is a very nice tool that goes beyond just straight sketching, but actually adds information, like I said before. And what you can also do is you can combine multiple 360 sketches together, so that when you get to a certain point in one 360 sketch bubble, you can load another one, and that lets you create spaces that you can move through. So this is a sketch, for example, of a spaceship, maybe from from Star Trek. And then he's created a separate or two separate photo bubbles showing other rooms that are coming off this main room here. And so then you can load that into a tablet.
Welcome to
I'll
the
let
Star
him talk about
Trek.
it.
So here are the captain's chairs. This is Star Trek Next Generation. And what I'm going to do now is walk around, and I'm going to walk into this room over there. So we have to walk around the bridge, a little bit physically constrained here. But the beautiful thing is that this room nicely, the physical room nicely maps into our AR version of it. And like in the room, and I have some see-through effects here. And we can go back into the other room, hop, hop, hop. And there we have space. This is actually the film studio where we're working. And we're back at the captain's chair.
So in that case, you can see he created a couple of 360 sketches and then linked them together in a mobile viewer that would let him walk through the real world and then load up the other sketch information. And so that's a very easy way to create that you're inside a virtual reality space. So that shows all about sketching. Of course, sketches allow you to build or draw or sketch out the different interface ideas. But what you want to do though is connect those ideas together and showing how the interface could be used. So that's typically done using storyboards. So here's a very simple storyboard. This talks about a little mobile augmented reality application that's used for language learning. So there's a woman, Sarah's learning Spanish, and she downloads this app that lets her learn Spanish. And when she goes to the store, she can point to her phone at different objects, and augmented reality tags will appear over those objects, giving the name of those objects in Spanish. So it's a simple storyboard, but you can see how this goes beyond just having showing the interfaces. It shows how you would use the application in the context. So you can do that same thing with those VR storyboard templates. Here's an example of having multiple VR templates, and then what you can do is you can draw in these templates one scene for each of the templates to tell that story. So here's an example of a simple storyboard. On the left-hand side, you can see a top-down view, and then the right-hand side, these are showing pieces of a virtual park. So you can imagine how these templates you could string together and maybe put 10 or 15 different sketches to tell how you use that user interface. Once from storyboarding, storyboard talks about the user experience of using the technology, and then what you want to go in wireframes and so what screens are connected together in the application, or what VR scenes, how do you navigate through them, and how do you interact with them. So it's really about functionality and layout, and not at all about the aesthetics or the look and feel. It's also about how the interface elements work together. So there's a set of 5 screens from a mobile app with little arrows through them, and it really shows how the user can navigate between the screens, going from the start to the introduction to either a map or a list view, and then down to another picture view and back again. So it's really about defining the interaction flow and leaving space for that design to still be created. Here's a more polished wireframe. This is a wireframe from an application that's used to create an augmented reality head-up display. And with this application, when you're flying in a real plane, you can hold your phone up to the window, and out the window, you'll see augmented reality tags in the real world. So an important part of that application is being able to know what flight you're on. And so this wireframe here shows the beginning of the app where you select the flight route, you download the list of features you can see, and then you pick the route, and then you can look in augmented reality and see the AR content, or you can go back and quit the app and delete it. So it's just a simple example again of how you use wireframing to talk about the interaction flow through the app. So here's another simple wireframe. This is for a mobile AR app that lets you put virtual trees in the real world to help with landscaping. So there's several pages. There's a home page, a garden center page where you can pick the plants you want, different category plays, things about the individual plants. You have an augmented reality view, and then on top of the augmented reality view, you can position the plant that you can see on the bottom row. So that's a very rough sketched out storyboard, but then from that you can make the storyboards as polished as you like. So on the right hand side you see a more polished storyboard of the same application. So now the trees are looking very nice, you've got a more polished layout, and you're starting to think more about the user interface elements that go on the screen. So that gets us towards mock-up. So storyboard, wireframing is really around the interaction flow, and then mock-ups is really about the final look and feel of the user interface. So the focus here is set it on look and feel, and you build on top of the wireframe because the wireframe has told you how you're going to move through the application, and now the mock-up tells you what you're going to see while you're doing that movement through the application. So the focus is really on high quality visuals and starting to create some of the final assets that you might use in that application, and also getting feedback on the design. So once you start making some mock-ups, you can take the design and show somebody and say, hey, does this make sense? Can you show for me how you would select or find the menu or select some object in the scene? So you can see the right hand side, a mock-up for an app called Cook Simple, and in this app you pick some menu, and then you can select the bowls and the saucepans you need to cook for that piece of food. Here's another example of using augmented reality mockup, and what they've done in this case is they've used some tool to create some 3D graphics. Then they've taken a photograph of the person in the real world, and then they've removed the background from the photograph of the 3D graphics, and then used that in an alpha blend and put that into the photograph. So on the right hand side you can see they've mocked up the floating menu in augmented reality for adding tags to the real world. So it's something you can do quite easily by using a variety of modeling software and sketching software. One of the fun things you can do though is you can start sketching user interfaces inside virtual reality, and this is really great because you can prototype VR applications or the interface for them while you're inside VR. So there are a number of tools you can use that support very intuitive sketching, and this allows you to create the design on a one-to-one scale. So it's, in many ways, it's better than just sketching on a piece of paper, because now you can see it in front of you. You can walk around the design elements and you can manipulate them at large scale. It also lets you do some really rapid user interface design and layout. So there's several examples of software that does that. Two of the most popular ones is the application called Quill, and also an application called Tilt Brush. So here's Oculus Quill. It supports VR drawing and storytelling, and it has an animation tool, and it supports some of the features you'll be familiar with from other photo editing tools like layers and having a canvas. But the focus is really on very fast sketching and drawing. So they're trying to reproduce what you do in pen and paper inside VR. So it becomes a very nice tool for really quickly sketching out the user interface. Here's an example of using Tilt Brush to sketch out a user interface.
All right.
I'll let Michael talk to this.
And we should be roughly looking at the camera. Okay, so with Tilt Brush, we can also sketch out an interface. So for example, here I've set it to use straight lines. So I could sketch out an interface this way, and I'll say, okay, actually I'm gonna have like a stop button here, and that's my play pause button, and maybe I'm gonna have like other, that was not so good, other videos to choose from. So like the top videos or something, top 1, 2, 3, 4 videos. And maybe my interaction is that we're gonna like click here or drag. So I could imagine doing.
Okay, so I'm using. So what he's doing here is he's drawing out the user interface for a tool for playing videos inside VR. So the main square there, that's the video playback area, and you've got a little pause play button on the right hand side. That is a little menu simulated now of the different videos that are available. As you said, one idea for using it would be to drag and drop a video from the menu on the right into the viewer. So you can see using Tilt Brush, it's very easy for him to drag and draw what it might be like to have that type of VR interface. And then because he can do it on one-to-one scale, he can now bring somebody else into VR and say, well, can you reach all the interface elements, or how does this look to you? So here's another example. This is from SketchUp, and this is a VR interface concept where you've got a virtual menu that appears on your hand. And so they just drew this really quickly, and actually this is drawn in Quill, sorry, but it's a VR concept interface for SketchUp. So they had the idea that on your hand, you'd see the SketchUp menus appearing, you've got a workspace of SketchUp, and then you can interact with it. So I'll play the video for that here. So there's some concepts written up in VR using Quill. And then you can see at the bottom there, they've had 3 different concepts. They've got the close-in concept, bodyline concept, and then here's the SketchUp interface floating inside VR. And then the person can then have their hand appearing in VR and the interface elements appearing onto the hand. So this is all done just by doing sketching and quick modeling in VR. But as you can see, it's quite a powerful tool, and it allows you to create a virtual interface that you could that you interact with to a certain extent. So now they're pulling out a drawer, and in the drawer they've got some documents. They can simulate what it's like to have documents floating around you in space. In augmented reality, this is an example of designing for AR, but in this case what they've done is they've taken a 360 photograph, and they brought the photograph into Quill, and then while they're in Quill, they can draw content that looks like it's superimposed over the real world because they've got the photograph as the background. So what they're doing here is they're trying to think about how to design a user interface that uses augmented reality for driving a car and showing map information. So let me just jump to the next page, and I'll play the video a bit larger. So you'll see on this video, this is a 360 image, like I said, in the background, but they've been able to add some AR content on top of the 360 video. So it looks like it's a real live AR experience. So there's a little mini map that appears on the car dashboard in AR. They've got some animations appearing on some lines. And then when you look up onto the dashboard, you can see larger virtual tags in the real world. And on the left-hand side of the window, you can see some directions to the coffee shop. So this is a very nice way of using Quill with an AR, with a 360 image background as a tool to be able to quickly mock up different AR experiences. So an important element of doing prototyping is actually to get the assets you need for the prototyping. So if you want to put 3D models into the scene or 2D images, then you need to either buy those assets or make them. So there are a number of websites you can go for that. Sketchfab is one of my favorites. So this is a web-based 3D library, and you go into Sketchfab and you'll find many free models as well as ones you can buy as well. But you can also build your own assets. There's a wide range of modeling tools. Blender, for example, is a free modeling tool, but there are also some paid modeling tools that support very natural modeling inside VR. So here's an example of one of those tools, which is Gravity Sketch. And so Gravity Sketch is an intuitive, immersive 3D design platform. And with Gravity Sketch, their goal is to try and take you from sketching through to the final 3D model render. So you can see on the top picture here on the left is a sketched interface of a shoe, and then all the way through the right, on the right hand side, this is the 3D model final render of that shoe. So Gravity Sketch supports very natural 3D user interaction using two-handed input, and it runs on several devices, and Oculus Quest, on the Steam, so other VR devices, or even a tablet. And there's support for collaboration, so multiple people can come in at the same time and work together. So let me show you a video of this working. And in this video, you'll see how easy it is to use Gravity Sketch to create 3D models. And of course, what you can do is you can bring those models out of Gravity Sketch into other applications for creating user interface mock-ups.
We set out to do something really big, change the way that everything is created in the world.
VR was really what we were waiting for. Gravity Sketch is a 3D design platform, and it should feel like a pen and paper. It should feel like something that you're used to doing every single day. You essentially have an infinite canvas, and you could start from napkin sketching, and you can refine it all the way down to a direct representation of what you're thinking, and the person viewing it can see it from any angle.
Being able to design with human proportions from day one, they're able to cut their design time substantially.
We're seeing design teams engaging with their clients directly in VR and let them experience the design really early before they invested loads of resources.
Let me just rewind that a little bit. So in case you didn't notice, in this motorbike example, there's actually multiple people in the view. So there's 3 headsets right now, a purple one, a green one, and a yellow one. So tools like Gravity Sketch allow teams to work together and to create content at the same time. Let me just play it again.
Directly in VR and let them experience the design really early before they invested loads of resources. There is no real equivalent to this. There's a certain enjoyment that you have when you create, when you make something. That has to be a fundamental part of our experience.
Now we have our community growing every day because of the Quest. People always say that VR is the future. It's not in the future. VR is now.
So that shows Gravity Sketch, and that Gravity Sketch is just one of a wide range of tools for developing 3D content. And once you've built those 3D models, then of course you can assemble them together into scenes, and that allows you to prototype the final user interfaces and also create a quite high fidelity view, which can be used for getting user interface. So there are a couple of nice tools for that. I've already shown you some of Sketchbox and how you can use that to sketch out user interfaces, but one of my favorite tools is Microsoft Marquette. And this is a free tool from Microsoft that allows you to build 3D user interfaces from inside VR. So it basically allows you to prototype VR interfaces from inside VR and to use the 3D user interface for prototyping. But if you do know how to code, then once you've built those scenes up, you can also export into Unity from them, and there is some support for JavaScript programming. So let me show you a little video of Maquette working. So in this video here, they're showing a mock-up for a shoe store in VR. So they're adding virtual shoes, they're adding some text, and this is supposed to be the user interface that you'd use inside VR to select the shoe you want to try on or buy. So there's some pop-up menus they've got, some more text, some more shoes, and I'll put a rack of shoes there. So they're able to quickly build a 3D user interface for a shoe store. Here's some other examples of doing some kind of storyboard mock-ups in VR. This is a museum experience. This is another shopping experience. And so you can do annotations, you can navigate through. This is the game level, so you can mock up what that might be like. And this is some sort of education experience, and I've got no idea what this is. But you can see with Marquette, it's very, very easy to quickly lay out a 3D interface and then get feedback from that. And as I said, this is completely free, and you can run it on a wide range of VR devices. There's also lots of tutorials online for Marquette. So if you go to YouTube and type in Marquette in virtual reality or Microsoft and Marquette, you'll find dozens of tutorials showing you how to use it. You can also do something, so that's scene assembly in VR, but there are also many applications you can use that will allow you to do scene assembly in augmented reality. And so there are a number of companies that provide web-based interfaces for this. So you can create an account, you log onto the website, you upload into the website the assets that you have, and then you can also design your user interface and publish, and it gets pushed out to the mobile phone. So you can see at the bottom here a company called Alupa, and that's their mobile interface at the bottom. They've just added a dinosaur to it, and then you can, from using their web-based service, you can then publish that as an app, and it'll appear on your mobile phone. So the number of companies doing this, and I'll just show you the work again from Alupa, but there's also Wikitude and Blipper and Catchoom and others. So this is Alupa Studio. Alupa Studio is a web-based AR authoring tool. So you can see on the left-hand side this interface that will appear on the web, and it has a wizard that guides you through creating a mobile AR experience. And then on the right-hand side is a picture of how this might be used in the catalog, and as you scan the catalog, you will have some AR content appearing, popping up. So here's a video showing how you would use that studio to be able to create your own mobile AR experiences.
From Alupa here. Today I'll give you a quick demo on how to create a marker-based AR experience with the Alupa Studio. You can create your own augmented reality experience in a matter of seconds. First off, you need to create an account by heading to studioarlupa.com. I already have mine created, so I'll just sign in. We have the Arlupa Studio open now, so let's start creating an AR experience. Once you've created an account, go to Create New Experience at the top bar menu. Choose the type of experience you'd like to create. In our case, it's marker-based. Click Next. As you can see, there is a variety of content options you can choose from, like video, GLB file, Unity, YouTube, Sketchfab, and Google Poly. For our purpose, we'll choose video and click Next. We need to enter a title for our experience. I'm going to create an educational AR experience about tigers, so I'll just put tiger info. You can have a description, it's optional, like my experience. Next, choose a video file. And last, we need to choose a marker image. This is the target image. Now, a few words about markers. For better trackability, be sure to choose an image that has good contrast, is rich in detail, and preferably has no repetitive patterns. Markers that possess these attributes will enable the best detection and tracking performance when uploaded to the Arlupa Studio. Good examples include images with street scenes, groups of people, and mixtures of items. Images with bright and dark regions and well-lit areas, like the one I'm using today, work the best. So here we go. Click Next. Here you'll be able to adjust the position, rotation, and scale of your content. In our case, we are satisfied with the defaults, so let's hit Publish. And voila, we've successfully created a marker-based AR experience. The content will be manually moderated and will be notified by email when it's activated. Once your content has been approved by an administrator, you'll get an email like this confirming that your experience can now be viewed in the Arlupa app. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so you can see how quick and easy it was using this application to quickly create some or upload some virtual video and then associate it with the physical marker. And that's quite common. There are many applications that provide the same functionality. And once you've got that running on your phone, you can use this to mock up several mobile phone-based user interfaces as well. Another great tool that is useful in this case is the Vuforia Studio. And Vuforia has provided a very good augmented reality tracking library. And Vuforia Studios uses that library, but in the drag and drop interface, it allows you to create AR scenes. So this allows you to import CAD models, to animations, to even combine it with Internet of Things sensors. So here's a little video of this working. So you can see this is a drag and drop interface. You can drag the 3D content, in this case a motorbike. You can drag the tracking image you want to track. Now when you look at the tracking image in the real world, you'll see a virtual motorbike appear over top of that image. They're just going to reduce some of the file format or file size. You don't need to be able to see every screw, for example. So there's the AR view again, and now they're showing a little animation where they can play to see how to take off the rear view. And Vuforia supports multiple tracking technologies like object tracking or image tracking. So it's one of the most robust augmented reality platforms you can get in the market. So that's typical of the type of application that you could use to create AR experiences without any programming at all. So let me give you an example of how you might go through the whole process. And this is an example of mocking up a user interface for Twitch VR. So this is the basic process you go through: collecting what tools you want, imagining the user and doing some user-centered design, sketching out the interface and storyboarding it, collecting the assets you need, creating the interface scenes, and then finally recording that as a video that you can show somebody. So this is the tools that the person used. They had their PC, a head-mount display, Google Blocks and Poly, Sketch Box for prototyping, and then Sketchfab for the presenting. You can't read this, but this is a basic sketch of the user interface and a little storyboard of how it might be used. So many of you may be aware or use Twitch to follow the gaming services. So this idea he was using, he wanted to be able to view Twitch from inside a VR and be able to see the VR content or the videos inside the VR environment. So that was his mock-up. Then we need to create some 2D assets. So there's a tool like Sketch, which is free, or Figma, and these allow you to create a collection of 2D images and interface elements that you can be combined together in a very photorealistic way. So here's Figma, and Figma you can lay out all those assets and associate the assets with a certain project. So whenever the person opens up that project, they can see all the images and videos and other content that goes with the project. And then once you've got the 2D elements, you have to also think about what the 3D elements are. And in this particular example, the person used Google Blocks to create 3D elements. So Google Blocks is a very, very simple viewer, but it's still a fun tool to use for very rapid prototyping. So I'll play the video of this.
In beautiful, imaginative places. But without 3D objects to fill them, these places aren't nearly as special. Today, 3D modeling is done on two-dimensional screens, but our world is not two-dimensional, and designing for it shouldn't be either. That's why we built Blocks, a free app for the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift that lets you easily create beautiful 3D objects in no time. Using a set of simple tools, you can insert shapes, move them, paint them, or modify them. Once you've created your model, you can export it or publish it to the web for others to see. To learn more, visit vr.google.com/blocks.
So this is a super easy tool to use, even if you had no 3D modeling experience before. And as you saw in that video, once you've built your little scene, you can then publish it to the web and let your other friends be able to try and give feedback on it as well. So he used Google Blocks to be able to create interface, and then and some interface elements, and then he brought that into to Sketchbox and used Sketchbox to create the whole scene that appeared. And the interesting thing about Sketchbox is that it's a collaborative design tool, so you can have multiple users in VR at the same time. So once you sketch out the Sketchbox interface, you can bring in several people to look at it to give feedback. So here's a little demo of how Sketchbox works. So you can see here they're making a menu item, and they've got some screens in the back. So again, they're trying to build like a video viewer inside VR. So they've created a couple of screens of video. They're putting some play arrows. They're going to a Photoshop tool or a text editing tool to create add tags onto there, and they can import other objects as well. So they can import the objects they made from Google Blocks and bring them into Sketchbox and then arrange them in the final scene. When you're doing this, one thing that's really important to remember is that you're really designing for layers. So in a AR or VR scene, you'll have the far off layer, and so this is the background. And that's really the environment. Then you have what's in the background in terms of objects. You have an object layer, and then you have an interface layer that's always on your head, that's always visible. So not everything goes interface layer. You know, you can have you want to be able to tag objects in the real world, obviously, for a AR interface. So then the designer, those tags and the UI around that have to form that object layer. So when you're designing for augmented reality, please think about the layers. Now that might affect your design. So this is the final video that he put together. And so you'll see how he's gone from sketching on paper through to being able to produce what looks like a fairly fully featured little demo. So let me play this for you.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Twitch VR concept made in Sketchbox. So what you can see here is that I made a little concept prototype of how people would use a VR version of Twitch later on. So let's dive in. You can see this is a virtual surrounding that this guy is in, all kinds of displays he has in front of him. What actually can he see? Let's see it closer. So you can see he's actually looking a stream of the Nier, the game.
Okay, so I'm not going to play the whole video, but it's quite long. But you can see here how he's been able to use the Google Blocks to bring in some interface elements and be able to create the look and feel of a large video being played and a playlist as well. And from inside this, you can also view that inside the head-mount display and get the feeling of what it's really like to be inside that user interface. So that gives you an idea of the process to go through from sketching through to creating assets and then bringing the assets together into a VR scene that you can experience together.
Hello, everyone.
But until now, most of what we've talked about have been static things, you know, so that scene, for example, was a static scene. So it's very important to be able to also add transitions to the user interface as you're prototyping. In fact, Bill Buxton said that unless you can show me where you've fleshed out the character and aspects of the transitions at the same level of fidelity, then as you have the states, then you're fired. So Bill Buxton is a very famous interface researcher at Microsoft. And what he's talking about is that it's really the user experience is really what happens between user interface states or between scenes, and it's that transition. So what we need is some tools that allow us to mock up AR or VR interfaces, but then also support animation or interface transitions between the different states. Now, it turns out there are some tools that do that. One very popular tool is paper prototyping. So paper prototyping, you know, is a variant of sketching, and it allows you to build or test quite interesting user interfaces just using papers and pen. So here's some basic materials you'll need: paper and scissors and knives and glue and pens. So here's an example of a mobile phone-based prototype. And what they've done in this case is they've built a phone shell out of cardboard. And then in the shell, they've left blank where the screen is. And the user can pull pieces of paper through that blank screen to simulate different screens that will be shown on the mobile phone. And then they can simulate logging in and putting a password and setting menus and so forth. So let me show you the video of this. So now we're going to do some keyboard input. So you can see he's got a little keyboard popping up and pretends to type on that. And then he's going to sign up, and then it takes him through to sign up as a user. So you can see obviously no programming involved with this, just some sketching, but now you can support some interaction and go between those screens. So you can do the same thing in VR, and this is from the paper that Michael wrote 2 years ago again. He's showing you here how you can do 360 paper prototypes for VR experiences. So you've got a 360 background, in this case is forest, and then you've got other pieces you want to pop out of the foreground. So some trees and rocks, and there's a deer there on a piece of cardboard. And so this allows you to lay out 360-degree content around the user. It also lets you support interaction over the grid lines. And you can use objects that have different size to simulate depth information. So here's what the final thing looked like, and here's a video of it working.
Players look right, and all flies from the right side of the screen towards player, and the lens on the
So you'll hear the lady, she's basically reading a story, and they're adding storytelling elements to the 360 scene as she talks about them. So she's now saying the deer is coming, so the deer appears as well. So you've got that 360 paper prototype, and then you can superimpose that onto those sketch lines we talked about before. You've also got the various interface elements that are in the foreground, and then you can combine that together, and then you can take photographs of the combined object and then view the photographs inside a 360 viewer. And it really does create a compelling experience that you're really there. So here's an example of the user interface being viewed through the scene there. Let me just play that again. Okay, so that shows you how you can make a VR preview with a 360 image, and then some moving characters to move around with it as well. And then one of the other things that Michael likes to do is do 3D modeling with clay. So you can use clay to simulate the AR content you might see in the real world. It's very easy and fast to model with clay. I think he showed an example of that with the Lion King example. And then you can view that through a mobile phone and get the impression of what we'd like to see that AR content appearing in the real world. So this can be used to bring characters to life, to give a sense of complexity between the objects, and also information about the interactions and the spatial relationships. So you can build this into, for example, a diorama, and this lets you create a 3D scene in the physical world, and you can explore playing out how characters would interact with that, and if there's any special relationships or requirements they may have. So creating these animations is very nice, or transitions and storytelling, but you should be able to also represent it in a more permanent way. So it's quite popular to use video sketching to create interface mock-ups, and these allow you to create elements of the real world, and then you can bring in photographs or sketches into that to create the AR overlaid contents. And the benefit of this is it lets you demonstrate the product or a user application or a particular piece of material very easily. You can also discover where the concept needs fleshing out, where some gaps are in the user interface for people, and whether it communicates experience clearly or not. So I can't show you this video because it's copyright by Apple, but this is an example Apple showed at the last developer conference about this Toast AR application, they said. So you can see on the left, they've taken a picture of a piece of toast, and they've added some virtual AR content that rates the toast. And on the right, they've done the same thing, except this time the toast is in a toothpick. So you can stick it into the annotations in a toothpick. You can stick it into the piece of toast. Then you can move your phone around to see what it looks like in a tagged like that. So here's a little video from Google that talks about the value of this type of video AR sketching.
Interested in immersive design, but aren't sure how to get started? We're here to demystify designing for augmented reality.
First off, augmented reality blends the digital information with the user's physical environment.
In other words, AR augments the user's base reality to provide them additional content or context about that reality.
AR is important because it enables us to have interfaces that are more lifelike, understandable, and seamless with the actual world around us.
At Google, we rapidly prototype for AR in order to show how blending the physical and the digital can help our users.
And we're going to show you how to get started prototyping AR experiences with things you have laying around the office in 60 seconds.
Let's say a user is learning a new language. What if they could scan the world around them and automatically see the translation? Usually, our next step would be to jump into 2D wireframes. With AR, we need to think in 360, so we proceed by prototyping with things around us.
It can be as lightweight as using paper or modeling clay or blocks to show potential UI or AR objects in 3D space. Plus, we can play with motion. 2D UI tools can be great for mocking up AR micro-interactions, and it can be even faster than paper. To take this to the next level of fidelity, we'd bring this into video editing tools. And there you have it. A quick prototype that serves as an augmented reality proof of concept. To learn more, check out Google's augmented reality design guidelines for pointers.
So we'll stop it there, but you can see how they can quickly make a video that simulates an AR view. So as an example of what that might be like, this is a video that a group of students made that simulates an AR interface for selecting a screen that you want to cast a presentation onto. So the idea is you walk into a room, you can hold your phone up or a tablet, scan around, and you'll see a bunch of AR content appearing in the room, such as the name of the monitor and a connect button you can use. But in this case, of course, none of that's yet real. So in this case, they've mocked it up by using a paper prototype, and one person's holding a frame through which another person can see the real world. And they also got a variety of AR pop-ups as well. So I'll just play this video.
So I've just walked into the room and I can see the sketch wall and 5 whiteboards are available. Now I can see TV7 and TV6 and I want to connect to TV7. And I will tap it. And it's telling me how to connect and it's showing me a button. So I will tap on connect. Wait, like that. And now it's telling me to download the via app, and I will tap on download, and it's downloaded, and now I can run it by tapping it. And I think the VIA app is now open.
So that's obviously some papers that people made a mock-up of the interface and then brought it into a video and videoed it, and then they can now use that to communicate with their potential end users and show them what the app might look like. Or they could also use it to pass off to an engineer and have them build the engineering, do the engineering of the app based on the vision they've shown here. A lot of companies also will use concept movies. So, you know, with video editing tools, you can create a quite nice looking movie that explains how you use the technology for your particular user experience or application. So here's some screens shots taken from the original Google Glass user interface. And then there's also a little concept video as well. In this video, what you see is part of a day of this person's life, and you'll see that the head-up display is being able to use to take photographs or provide map information or other things as well.
Meet me in front of Strand Books at 2.
So you can see how that's mocking up the Google Glass interface. These kind of bubbles above your head, and he's got an alert notice now. And when he looks towards the subway, you see the subway service is suspended, and then he can use the map interface to walk and find his friend who's waiting for him at the map. So this gives you another example of how you can take video and use the video to be able to prototype a futuristic user interface. This is one of my favorite examples. This is from Samsung, and this is their concept of what you might be able to do when you've got 5G enabled smart glasses. So let's play this here. So in this case, he's got all the computing power on his head or remote somewhere else. And this is just a mock-up, obviously, what the future interface might look like. So here's a conferencing call. You can now zoom in and see that AR space as a real VR space. And there's some other applications it shows as well. So this type of application video is quite common for big companies like Samsung. But other researchers can use the same concepts as well and use that to create a video prototype or mock-up of what your interface might look like. But in this case, the AR content you're seeing isn't animated or moving at all. So there are some tools you can use to create animated VR experiences that allow you to video them, or you can play it back as a VR experience. So Tvori is one of the software tools that do this, and it's animation-based VR prototyping. So you can see a number of key features there, things like importing 360 images, having support for multiple users, being able to build an executable that you can deliver to somebody and run it and give you feedback as well. So this shows an example of two animation or user interfaces for Tvori. So in the first one, you'll see they use this kind of timeline to be able to let you start and stop animations. And then you can just add objects to the timeline easily using the gestures inside VR or the controllers. And then you can control the timeline playback as well. So you can use this as a mock-up to be able to talk to people about how they could fit their exhibit into the conference. And so on the right-hand side, you can see again another mock-up or VR prototype of a bookmark cloud. So once you've been using lots of bookmarks in your web, you can have them floating around you in a cloud, and you can use spatial cues to arrange them and organize them in much better ways. So I just wanted to show you another Tvori demo. This demonstrates the AR view through a tablet. So you can see the background will be VR graphics, and there'll be a tablet you brought into VR that simulates the AR view that you might see. So here's the user interface, and they're prototyping, so you can prototype your AR apps. One of the things we know is a problem is with a lot of AR displays that have a very wide field of view. So this is prototyping might be looking like when you've got a narrow field of view. You can see the background is shown as VR of the real world, but then you're trying to simulate AR, so you've got this phone or head-mount display, you're only able to see part of that view in any one time. But tools like this are very nice tools to build very realistic content and get feedback from some of the end users about that content. This is one of the timelines they use for animation, so they can select different objects or body parts on the objects, and then bring those into VR to show what it would be like to have a VR interface with Usenet. Oh, and this is another example from Tavori, sorry. This shows one of my favorites. This shows you how you can use it to mock up an augmented reality view on a mobile phone. You can see the mobile phone is there, simulated, and then when he pans around, there's some notifications that appear, and then they can mock up panning around to select a surface for doing the tracking and overlaying onto the surface. So you see just in a second, he will start putting, well, actually you can see those are virtual chairs that are appearing around the table. And so you can use this app to mock up what your furniture would look like, or different furniture would look like here inside your apartment. So let me talk through a longer example. This is going from sketch through to video. So the idea was to build this augmented reality hockey game called AR Hockey. And the concept was that you would play air hockey in the real world, and the virtual content would respond to the real player's body movements. And you'd also combine elements in the real world into the final game. So here's some cardboard props that we used to mock up. This is the sketch here. So they had the idea that they would project onto the floor and the walls of a real space they can play in. And then the body will be tracked using the Microsoft Kinect hardware and software. And you can see in the sketch there in the middle, it talks about Kinect. So here's some of the projected content that's mocked up, what you might see projected onto the floor. So there's a single spot or a bunch of green and blue guys with some spots. And so it becomes very easy now to convey your concept to other people because they've seen the sketch here. This is a more 2.5D sketch to show you how the players go through the game setup. And then here's some photographs of who are really playing it. So in this case, you have a couple of people, the players, and you've got somebody else who acts as the computer and moves the objects around. So you can see on the left-hand side, a person with a kind of a red ball on a stick. So the red ball is supposed to simulate the virtual content, but in order to have it move, then the person holding the stick has to run around providing what's called a Wizard of Oz user interface study. So once they went from that mock-up, they made a physical mock-up. In this case, they used little Lego figures, and they created a scale version of the classroom. But they can also project onto that as well, so you can see the projected dots of the classroom as well. And so here's a video of that working. So you can see two Lego blocks in the real world, and now they're going to start to mock up what a gameplay might be like if they can project onto the floors of the real world. So this is playing the game in daytime, so they want a lot of, and then this is at nighttime where they're trying to project dark views as well. But in both cases, they get the projector working, and you can see that using input, they can simulate colliding with different objects and have some little behaviors running off that. And so this is the little stop motion video they made that introduces the air hockey concept. So yeah, you can see how useful this could be to be able to convey your design idea as well. So Michael's not quite here yet. So I want to go through another example, but in order to show that, I need to just skip ahead a little bit. And then when he joins us, we can go back onto the next level. Okay, great. So this is another prototyping example that was developed by my lab in New Zealand. And so at one time I was living in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's a very beautiful city. You can see on the left-hand side the boats going down the River Avon, which runs through the centre of the city. The right-hand side is the Christchurch Cathedral. So many of you may remember that 10 years ago there was a very big earthquake in Christchurch, and so the earthquake actually took down the spire of the cathedral. So that's what the cathedral looked like after the earthquake. Fronts of buildings fell off, and there's even some people that got hurt and killed in the earthquake. So it was a 10-year anniversary coming up, and what we wanted to do is be able to build a mobile AR/VR app to help people remember what happened in those times. So the goal is to create a mobile app that will allow people to view immersive panoramas showing what the city used to look like as well. And so this uses obviously a mobile phone with GPS and a compass on there. And the one user experience will be that people could walk around the real city in the downtown. And as they're walking around on their map view, they'll see locations that were locations of photographs taken right after the earthquake. And then when they walk closer to that, this will automatically pop up onto their mobile display showing the picture. So in building that prototype, these are the tools that we used. So we had some paper sketches, some PowerPoints to do the wireframing, some sketch screens, an application called Pop, which Michael will talk about a bit later. We then collected the assets together in Photoshop and PowerPoint. We then brought them into a more high fidelity prototyping tool called Proto.io. And then finally, there was some code written in Unity, and we also used this plugin from Mapbox that supports maps in VR. And we can make a demo video from that and finally publish. So you can see there's quite a lot of steps through, and in fact, there was no code that was developed or written until step number 7. So most of this process of prototyping you can do without any coding. So let me show you the interface, and actually you can get this app yourself if you want to. If you go to the App Store and type in CityView AR, you can download it and try it for yourself. So this takes us through the process that we went through from idea to product. So first of all, we had some idea of what people wanted, and we made a list that defined those requirements. And then we sketched out some interface elements just on pen and paper. From those rough sketch interfaces, we could build a wireframe that show what it would look like inside the phone and see if we missed any steps out in terms of using the phone. We could then bring that into a mobile phone and start interacting with it. So build a little interactive prototype, and then create a high fidelity prototype using some of the final images we've got from the various people or businesses that were we need to replace and show in the final app. So this shows the kind of high fidelity scene that will be the splash screen. And then we finally get to Unity coding, and then user testing and deployment. So you can see these are the steps we went through in this case. An important thing though is this was developing from paper to prototype, but there's also this iteration chain at the back end as well. So we could show somebody in the interactive prototype, and they would say, oh, can you change it these ways? Then we'll go back and make a sketch or a wireframe of that, and then go forward again as well. So it's really an iterative process. So here's the interaction flow with the wireframe I put together. So it's really simple, just 5 screens with a pretty straightforward flow going through it. From that though, we discovered that actually we hadn't included a credits screen or a help function, so we added that separately. And then this was just done using PowerPoint, using a simple layout. So now we've got the interaction flow. We can sketch some user interfaces and start looking at how they interact for real. So here's the sketch interfaces that we've made. And then we brought it into this tool called Pop. And Pop is a really amazing piece of software that allows you to take photographs of user interfaces and then bring them into Pop and highlight the interaction areas on the photograph, and then specify a transition to another photograph. So it's a way you can very quickly mock up like mobile AR, retail, or other types of experiences. So let me show you the video of it working. So this is with Pop. Once you've done the sketches and you've copied it onto your phone, then you can use it all the time to create videos like this. So you can see he hit the start button. So that's one of the first things we can support or look at doing, is doing a more rich density. But anyway, so this shows you how you can see the interface. And Pop's really amazing. You can basically create user interface, and you can create all the familiar transitions you're used to, like fading left and right or scrolling up and down. So here's the assets we used. We were lucky to get some panorama images. So we had a big panorama image of pieces of the city, and we got these icons as well. We brought them into this tool, like I said before, called Proto.io, which makes it very easy to drag and drop the user interface. And then most importantly, you can integrate other people's code or content as well. So if you happen to have some really great photographs of UCLA or the Santa Monica Beach in Los Angeles, then you can use those to bring into the final assets together to bring the final look, make it the final look and feel. So you can see here, we've got some of the photographs of the buildings. We've got them in the asset library. You can bring them all together. And then we can use that to test as well. So with Proto.io, you can deliver the URL to somebody else, and they can then try it in their browser and see and interact with it as well. So you can see there's the phone screen. That little dot there is my finger, and then I can click on the list view or the map view and go through interacting in space. So it works out really, really well, and it's very easy to share and get comments from other collaborators in this. And then finally, we had the final interface design. So here's the interface objects. This is the map with the tags on it. There's a list of locations with photographs, and here's one of the final photographs. And then at this point, it was the first point we actually brought into Unity. So we've actually done, up until this point, 5 or 6 weeks of work in terms of sketching out user interface design and doing some high fidelity interface elements. Then we can transfer that over to an engineer and pass them also the wireframes and the other pieces we developed, and just basically say, here, build this. So this is what the build looks like. Then we deploy it to the asset store. And now this is a demo of the application here that Gun is using. So you can click onto the application, you can start it up. It takes a little while to get started. And then actually, this is showing the splash screen. And then you can go from the splash screen to the credits page, or you can go from that to the actual application itself. So here's a page of instructions. We want to keep it deliberately easy because we felt some people, especially elderly, may have a hard time using it with that if the instructions weren't very simple. And now they're going to try and tap to continue. There's a little bit of a text page on the introduction that talks about the earthquake. And then the next page will talk about some of the actual architecture they're using. So here's the map that we use. And as you pan around, you'll see these little red icons. Those red icons are where we have panorama images currently, although we're looking to expand much more. And so now you can click into the Cathedral Square. Now the person can look around, and they even while viewing the demo of Cathedral Square. So I'll go forward from that. So hopefully some of the take-home messages you got from that is that there are a number of tools you can use now for rapid sketching, and you can also not only design still interfaces that you want to have in a sketch, but also talk about the transitions between them and how you can support that working really well. So that's everything I wanted to say today. We'll have a break now, and let me just escape from the slide share. Before we go on though and take that break, does anybody have any questions that they would like me to answer about what I've shown you so far, or other questions as well? What, for example, what Michael talked about. I'm happy to answer some of those as well. So Frank said that lots of platform. What is your suggestions over the considerations of VR, AR platforms or hardware? So that's a good question. There are many different types of platforms and hardware you can use. I think it's hard to answer that question because it really depends a little bit on the user experience you're trying to develop. So for example, with the City View AR application we're building, we were targeting a mobile phone platform. And because of that, that meant there were several tools that we could use that was suitable for the mobile phone. But those same tools wouldn't have been good to use for head-mounted, for example. The hardware and software platforms that you use and the tools used for prototyping to some extent depend on, or to a lot of extent depends on the user interface you're trying to develop. So does anybody have any other questions? And I should also mention, if you send me an email, I'm happy to give you all the slides that you're seeing today. And a little bit later on, Mike will talk about, we've got some resources we've got online as well. So you can definitely get this. And of course, this presentation is being recorded and put onto YouTube as well. Okay, so if there's no more questions, then I think what we'll do is take a 15-minute break. By the watch here, it says it's 4:45 actually, sorry, in Bari. So we'll take a break till 5 o'clock, and then Michael will come back and talk about more on the high fidelity prototyping side and some of the really exciting tools you can use for that. So I'll see you all in 15 minutes. Go and grab a coffee or a bite to eat or use the restroom or whatever, and we'll come back at 5 o'clock Central European time. It's 4:45 now, so in 15 minutes from now. Thanks a lot. Okay, we'll get started in a minute or so. So hopefully a few of you come back from the bathroom or from getting a snack or wherever you're doing. And we can get started. 5 o'clock, sorry, not 4 o'clock. Yes, it's 4 o'clock in the morning here in New Zealand, Australia, in New Zealand, so I'm a bit disoriented when it comes to time zones in Italy as well, so it's pretty early. While we're waiting for a couple more people to join that were at before the break, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them into Slack, into the chat window, and I'll endeavour to answer them. And also you can ask a question over the microphone or type onto Discord as well. And of course, we'll be able to view the Discord for a number of days to come. So let me share my screen again, and just got a few more slides left, and then Michael should be joining us anytime to take over and talk more about high fidelity prototyping. Oops. So this is my screen here. And I just need to go down and go into present mode. There we go. So I wanted, oh, that's not what I wanted to show you. I want to show you another. So I just showed you before the AR hockey example and how they went from a sketch to a working video. I'm going to show you another example, this time inside a head-mounted display. And this is called the AR demo one. And in this case, they wanted to build a prototype for a head-up display in an AR headset. So there's some rough sketches you can see there. The tools they used was some storyboarding for the concepts. This is the storyboard up there. A tool called Sketch I talked about before, that you do 2D interfaces. It's for the Mac. Cinema 4D for some animation. Sketchbox, load the content into a VR scene. And then also Photoshop and PowerPoint for the final mockups and interactivity. So this is the initial sketch design. So what they did is they basically took some user interface elements and arranged them on a picture that had been blurred of the background to try and create the illusion of what it would look like to have this AR interface. And so this is Cinema 4D. Cinema 4D is a 3D animation tool that allows you to create 3D interface elements. And now that they could start using this to mock up the different interface elements. And then Sketchbox allows you to bring some of those objects into a 3D interface. And so this is what 3D interface would look like. Then they use Photoshop to create this experience or image of the user interface over the person's in the real world. And then the final prototype was a PowerPoint prototype. And so in this case, you could basically have the user interface elements here. But because you're using PowerPoint, you can also support simple interaction. You can click on interface elements and jump to other slides that show what you could do while you're interacting with the interface. So you can see by using a number of different tools with no programming at all, they're able to develop this mobile or this head mount display interface for the HoloLens. So that's everything we're talking about in terms of low fidelity prototyping. I'll turn the time over now to Michael, and he can talk to you about high fidelity prototyping and in particular prototyping interactivity. So most of what I showed you so far has just been for creating the sketched interface ideas, and then developing some of the look and feel of the final interface, but hasn't shown you how to prototype more rich interactions in the AR interface or VR interface. So now Michael will talk about that and also talk about some of the development tools. So I'll stop my screen sharing. Is Michael available? Oh, his desk, his chair's there. There you go. So it's over to you, Michael. Perfect timing. Can you hear okay?
Yep, can hear you okay. Thank you very much, Mark.
Great. Okay,
Was
go for it, Michael.
there anything that was in your portion that you said I would show, or was there everything cool?
No, I think I went through all of it. It was fine, so it's all good. I talked a little bit about what you did before with 360 photographs for doing mock-ups, and also the multi-layered 360s you've done, and you're using clay for some mock-ups, but that's fine. So now you can take over and talk about prototype interactivity and also high fidelity prototyping. And I'm happy to jump back in if you want me to contribute a little to the discussion about research and research directions, or
yeah, that would be great to have you.
Anyway,
for that.
Take it away.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. So here we are back. So Mark has actually already shown you some elements of how interactivity could be prototyped in this block. We want to take it even further. I also so basically we'll continue the discussion of high fidelity, where we actually focus on the interactions and the experience design. And you've seen some of the elements, but the tools I want to very quickly go through the process one more time for a solar system experience, and then I actually want to spend more time on immersive authoring and XR development. So from lo-fi to hi-fi prototyping is very interesting. So in a lot of the projects that we do, actually I need to mute this guy. We often have, so I often start on paper. I said this a few times. And then here's a critique of an AR experience where I sketch out a storyboard afterwards. Okay, so storyboarding we've discussed. So this is, for example, here from an expedition, a storyboard that I created where I could bring in different elements from different planets from the solar system. And so I would critique it. I would develop my storyboard. In this case, I would be looking for things in the experience that I can improve. It's not a completely new experience that I wanted to work on. Then I would use some of the 360 templates that I introduced or that Mark maybe mentioned. So this 360 sketch grid is a very interesting way to design around the user and think a little bit more in, it's technically not 3D since it's actually using projection from a 2D template, but it allows me to design fully around the user. Then I can preview these things in, for example, Cardboard or Oculus headset. I often like to work with Cardboard because I can just, Cardboard is the cardboard-based VR device where you put your smartphone inside. Because I can cut out a corner of the cardboard to expose the camera, and then I have a very rapid workflow of prototyping on paper and experiencing it directly in the form of VR. Some of the things we want to expand on, and you may have seen elements of this, is I can also do more 3D immersive authoring for storyboarding or even creating more complex prototypes in some of these tools, including Microsoft Maquette. Actually provide support for scripting and more interactive experiences. But I would often go in and just storyboard out things in 3D. Then actually, sometimes I take it further back on paper. It's very interesting that you, in some sense, make the step back to paper often. And now you can already be on paper. You can actually already prototype some interactivity on paper using cutouts of paper and moving things around. And a lot of the prototypes, I was just coming back from my class where we actually looked at a lot of digital prototypes this week, but all the students previously created their physical prototypes and already demonstrated some interactions through kind of like Wizard of Oz, where you simulate some of the interactions that you would later implement. And it allows you to preview, for example, how the Earth goes around the sun and things like that. I would do physical prototyping modeling. I talked about this earlier, so it's a little bit of a repetition, but even there, I can already, it allows me to brainstorm through some of the interactions. That's, I think, is why physical prototyping is very important. And then ultimately, what I often do in my own work is actually use a mixed media approach where I do physical and digital prototypes, and often I use the physical prototype elements as assets for my digital prototypes. So what you see in the snapshot is actually some digital captures of some of the planets. And then I keep those here as static. And while I'm previewing some of these that are captured from paper and then extracted from paper and displayed and placed in AR, then I can still use some of the physical elements and move them physically. So it allows me to extend the AR experience that I have prototyped so far and actually prototype some new interactions around it using actually physical prototyping. So a very cool way to explore it. Ultimately, obviously, now we are entering the portion that maybe some of you were looking forward to as well, is like really prototyping using immersive authoring. Here, I'm using Adobe Aero and Apple Reality Creator, and those are things you can use on your iPad. And it allows you to really, in my case, place relatively basic 3D, actually more like primitives, geometric shapes as representatives of Earth is pretty green here, and the sun, and then the moon. And then I also can obviously do immersive prototyping. So we want to talk a little bit more about prototyping interactions in some of the immersive authoring tools. Here I'm using Blocks, where you can simulate a lot of interactions by just grabbing things and moving them around. Some of the tools, like I said, Microsoft Maquette actually have support for scripting, visual scripting often. So while you're in VR, you can actually define some scripts. And so we want to give you a little bit of an overview. Ultimately, you would go more like into coding and probably sit down and implement this interface and then actually run it. Here in this case, I actually used WebXR, so I used A-Frame. And the cool thing with A-Frame is, and it's not limited to A-Frame, it's also Unity is cross-platform. So here I preview the experience on an Oculus Rift S. So it doesn't actually have hand tracking, so I use a hand model. I could deploy the same thing on the Quest now and actually use hand tracking on the Quest because it's available through WebXR now. Or I can actually experience it in AR on my smartphone, and the same experience, just with the press of a button, at least that's the promise, allows me to experience my digital prototype in AR. And so I want to walk through a little bit more of the digital tools. So how do you prototype interactivity? So there's a lot of immersive authoring tools. Some of them actually have died now. Tool Creator was discontinued. Tiltbrush is very sketch-based, but Quill and some other immersive authoring tools like Microsoft Maquette are actually good for prototyping interactivity. Now, reality is, though, that a lot of interactions are still very difficult to prototype with tools, with existing tools that are just more click and play. And the reality is that you actually need oftentimes development and at least a form of scripting. So you have all these different approaches when it comes to implementing interactions. It really depends on which platform are you developing for. If you go web-based, you have a wide reach of devices, but you may be limited in the interactions that you can implement. If you choose the best experience in terms of interactivity is by choosing a specific SDK, so developing directly for Oculus, for example. The majority of us in the XR space are familiar with a tool like Unity or Unreal, and it's also cross-platform, so it allows us to create interactions that actually run on a number of devices. More fundamentally, I want you to walk away from this tutorial and keep in mind that there are different tools for different purposes. So the digital and immersive authoring tools that I'll show you some examples of in the next few slides are really good, mostly for storyboarding and envisioning interactions, but still very limited actually in terms of the interactions. And then when it comes to the three approaches, web-based, cross-platform, and native development, again, the fidelity that you can reach there is still a big difference between a web-based AR or VR prototype and a Unity or an Unreal VR or AR prototype. And then the best support you have when you develop natively for the devices. You will need scripting and development for that. So that's the point of that slide. But let us walk through some of the tools. So on the digital authoring side, so a tool that is I'm not actually sure how popular it is. So Amazon Sumerian is kind of like a web-based Unity, but it as a tool has access to the Amazon infrastructure. So the examples they have are actually quite advanced. But here I prototype the same scene, which doesn't have a lot of interactivity in this case. I'm just able to see a mirrored world. Basically, we're using an environmental map on that sphere that just basically reflects back the 360 photo of the environment around the user, and then actually it changes the aspects of the shape a little bit here. So digital authoring tools for VR like Amazon Sumerian or Unity, just the editor, are actually quite good for prototyping. So the initial assets and creating the scenes. You can have VR previews at the press of a button in most of these tools if you have a VR headset connected. Basic interactions can be implemented without coding. Advanced interactions still require scripting. There's no way around it. So in web that means JavaScript. In some of the other tools that means C# or C++. So in Unity it would be C# and in Unreal it would be C++. So there are more dedicated tools for digital authoring for AR. So a lot of the things that are marker-based AR experiences. Maybe you have seen some examples throughout this conference, or maybe some of the examples we showed earlier with Mark. So marker-based AR, Vuforia is a very popular library, and I'll show some examples of that in a bit. Lens Studio is a very powerful tool where I want to, so it's from Snapchat, where I want to show you some examples. And so these tools provide visual authoring of both marker-based and markerless AR. Sometimes your face is the marker. Oftentimes it's like a QR code or some kind of specific AR toolkit or a Roku, kind of like a fiducial, something that the camera can track and hold up. So that's marker-based. Or markerless AR apps you can also do. Sometimes you can create your own custom markers in the tools. Typically enable AR previews. So for Snapchat, Lens Studio, it's actually you can deploy it directly to your phone, and you can actually even deploy it on the Snapchat platform and have potentially millions of users give it a try. So that is interesting. So on the immersive authoring side, so that goes a little bit beyond digital prototyping. So you're not just looking mostly at the screen, 2D screen, and then maybe occasionally or quite frequently checking. No, you're actually inside VR or AR itself. So there we have tools like Google Blocks or Oculus Quill. These enable visual authoring of the 3D content and actually allow you to create a lot of the assets directly in VR. Really, the idea of immersive authoring is to edit while you're previewing and testing the experience, and it's a very good way. It really is a shortcut to testing and debugging from a desktop to an AR or VR device. But the complex interactions are actually still very hard. The focus is often on 3D modeling. You can do some simple animations and some basic scripting, but you wouldn't actually create an entire AR or VR experience in immersive authoring. It does have its limitations. The good thing is that most of these tools support exporting and then taking it actually further in a tool like Unity. And so exporting to different 3D model platforms and 3D model stores like Sketch, Fab. Google Poly is kind of dead now, so it's probably a little less relevant. But that used to be the platform that you would expect as export to from Google Blocks. So on the AR side, we have things like Apple Reality Composer. I think I said Apple Reality Creator before, sorry. Apple Reality Composer or Adobe Aero. These are things you can run on, technically you may be able to run them on your smartphone, but normally they would be run on, for example, iPad. So there are handheld AR authoring, immersive authoring tools, enable visual authoring of the 3D content, and then you have AR views, and you can actually author directly into the environment. So here I place relatively simple objects in my office area. You could make it a bit more interesting than that. I have more assets in there and can bring in some other assets. So make it possible to edit by previewing in AR, similar to obviously immersive authoring in VR, and provide basic support for interactive behaviors. Those include walking up to an object, gazing at an object, clicking an object. That's roughly it. Any more advanced events usually require different means of programming, and you can sometimes export to WebXR. So out of a tool, WebXR, or maybe some of the tools also support exporting elements at least, so that you can process them further in Unity. So let's look at it in more detail. Actually, this is an example that Mark used to show, but the Pop app is a very interesting way to compile a set of sketches, either on paper or digital sketches, and bring them into a phone, and so then allows you to experience that. It can be, it's very effective for 2D mobile. It can be used to prototype or at least preview the interaction flow of an AR experience, I would say. But it's limited in actually really prototyping the actual AR experience in terms of the reactions with the environment, and really getting an experience of what it would really feel like in AR. So, but it's still a quick way. I have a quick video here that gives you a sense of what's possible. So it could be sketches on paper. It could be sketches you have digitally. You cut and paste them together. You can define some hotspots to support basic interactions. And so you can actually create a clickable prototype. So very basic interactions, clickable prototypes, good for interaction flow. Based on digital or physical assets that you would align and compose together. So those of you who have done interaction design and used tools like Sketch or InVision or Figma or Marvel or Adobe XD, very similar concept, much less powerful in terms of the interactions it supports here. But the focus is actually to really get things to prototype quickly. So, and then it has integration with tools like Marvel, for example, which, so Proto.io is one of these more digital authoring tools, web-based, has increasing support for at least 360, so forms of VR. And I think all these tools, including InVision, are at least exploring how to better support prototyping of AR experiences. Adobe in particular has, apart from Aero, actually doesn't have a lot of really strong support yet. And I wouldn't consider Aero a really good AR authoring tool yet. So there's a lot of things to be desired in existing digital authoring tools and their support for AR. So Proto.io, so here the idea is you work mostly on your desktop, as discussed. So it's less about the bringing things from paper to digital, but more like creating an experience on the screen without coding, pretty 2D oriented interfaces. One of the things a lot of my students do in my class is using a combination of Figma, which is similar, I mean, in style as a prototyping tool is similar to Proto.io, but then it has an integration with a software called Vectory, and Vectory is more like a 3D authoring, web-based authoring environment. So you can actually then bring 3D assets into your Figma tool. Another thing that we often do is using Figma, and that's not true. Another thing we often do sounds so good. Another thing that you can do, but I actually haven't done myself, and some of my students have done that though, is Figma has an integration with Mixed Reality Toolkit. It's one of the toolkits I'll talk about in a bit. And so it allows you to prototype HoloLens 2 experiences, but using a tool like Figma that maybe you're familiar to. Anyway, the principles are the same between these digital prototyping tools, and it is fair, I think it is fair to say that their support for AR and VR at this point is still super limited. Still, they have their place in the workflow, in the process. And so the next thing you might want to do is then doing more interactive 360 prototyping for VR. There's actually some kind of tools popping up, and some are dying. So Google Tool Creator used to be a tool I used to introduce my students to, but it's actually dead now. So similar tools are InstaVR, VR Direct, or EasyVR. And I think Mark has used some of them in some of his projects. And so you would create kind of like 360 photo stories. So you might have hotspots and can create interactive elements within. Very quickly, you can preview in VR from a 360 photo, connect even multiple 360 scenes. And again, good for prototyping the flow and the story. I'm going to skip this video. I want to actually move on to some of the more advanced tools. So visual. So the tricky part will be implementing interactivity. I said some of the tools support visual scripting. Now, visual programming is often sold as a thing that would make it easier, especially for those who don't enjoy coding. And it can. But if you look at a graph like down there, to understand really what's going on, it's still a high learning curve to most visual programming tools. Nevertheless, the promise is that you can use mostly drag and drop using kind of like a block-based programming approach, where you then connect some of these nodes to define some of the interactivity. So we can take a quick look at VR Easy. It's only 1 minute, and that's more of a tool that Mark is familiar with. I actually haven't used it myself. But it seems like this is more like a Unity video here with an integration of VR Easy, and maybe it really the idea of VR Easy is then to make it make Unity more to reduce the learning curve of Unity and actually provide means for users to quickly prototype some of the elements. I'm not sure with the interactivity how far you can get, but you can see there are some like menu-based structures that you can prototype. It's a really fast video, so almost makes people sick. So we're gonna go and see. It might be that I have, oh, this is playback speed normal. So this is like how machines would design VR interfaces in the future. So really fast walkthrough here. Okay, so this was VR Easy. It looked pretty crazy. Let me see that I can actually get out of this. And unless Mark is still here, I mean, I wanted to have Mark to have a little break if you wanted to expand on VR Easy. That's cool. We can ask him later if there are questions. So the tools that I've used a little in the past, I mean, to be honest, I do most of the scripting myself and do not rely a lot on visual scripting. But what we've explored a little bit is an integration with Unity called Bolt, which supports visual scripting. So it's an extension of Unity. And then in Unreal, actually, to be honest, in Unreal Engine, which is another very popular authoring environment, visual scripting is really a lot of, you even define the material properties there in visual scripting. So it looks a little bit like this. You see a lot of the graphs that need to be read from left to right, and sometimes it's not clear where the starting point is, but here it's at least denoted in bold. And then you can define, for example, if you were to define an animation or here even an interaction that whenever this ball bounces and hits the floor, we want to change the material on collision, we could actually script that visually. So you would need to define colliders around the floor. And then when you detect the collision with the floor, you can have some kind of like random color selector on collision that then actually applies a random different material to this ball. And relatively, I mean, when you, the issue that I have with visual scripting, it's always very easy to see how this works when you see an example, but it takes a little bit of time to really get used to it to create your own visual scripts. But I guess it's the same with any kind of scripting. So visual programming is really a good way to quickly prototype experiences without writing a lot of code and trying out. What I really like about the visual scripting approach and visual programming is that you can really quickly play around with different parameters and preview them immediately. So Lens Studio is a tool that I think is really powerful, and I want to show some examples of Lens Studio. So Lens Studio is one of those tools that was actually created specifically for AR authoring. So Snapchat is a company, as you know, focused on AR. It actually in many ways has some of the most advanced AR techniques, but they primarily use it to create lenses that we can share with our social community. But Snapchat is technically an AR company. And so Lens Studio is really the tool that they created. So you can author and preview AR prototypes. It's actually the tool behind a lot of the lenses that you can see on Snapchat. It's a powerful AR prototyping tool. It has lots of templates and access to lots of features, very good on face tracking, but also environmental tracking, placing objects in the environment, interacting with objects through your hands. You will see some examples there. So I want to show you a very quick example of me prototyping a Snapchat experience. Very simple to do. What I wanted to prototype here is when I go to ISMAR or another conference and I have this virtual, so an AR, in the future I will have more an AR enhanced conference experience. I would, as I go there, I would potentially see other people, who they are, and maybe information about that. So in this case, I prototyped that very quickly, just like showing so here my first mock-up of that experience would be, okay, I can see some kind of business card style information, but the information I show around the user could be more helpful. And then I used, I played around with different templates they have in there. And the one that I used is the image tracking template that actually then places this image in a second as a face image, and it'll appear directly on my face. And it's cool because you have the live previews. You can see here in the bottom left, maybe, how this content now appears directly. And I can then place it visually relative to the user while I'm actually seeing how it would look like. So I'm using myself as a subject to prototype what it would look like if I were looking at other people at a conference and detect their faces and maybe their identity. And would then, as interesting considerations, where I would place the content and how I would style it, and maybe even what information I would show. But as a tool, allows me to quickly prototype around, for example, a human face. Lots of different starting points and templates in Lens Studio, including some of the more advanced portals and windows they have. So for each of these, there are quick walkthroughs and templates on Snapchat. This one is, I mean, it's 9 minutes quick, but it would teach you how to create, for example, a portal into this virtual world while you are. It's a smartphone-based AR experience, and you've probably seen these portals. But if you're curious how to prototype them, because this is often an interesting rendering issue, is actually just exploiting some elements of the rendering pipeline to create these portals. And so it's a matter of material that you apply to the 3D objects, and swapping materials inside and out when you actually enter the portal. And that's something you would learn by going through that tutorial. And it's a very popular type of interaction that is actually very difficult to prototype in most tools, but the Snapchat Lens Studio would be relatively easy. So we are now more entering the realm of authoring on device. So here, Adobe Aero is one example. Pretty interesting tool. It's not too much you can do with it. I mean, the video that you'll see here is from Adobe, and all these tools have the same vision. Support designers, make it very easy for them to express themselves in the medium, not asking them to program, but actually use the medium directly, and import assets and bring them into AR. And here the author previously created a painting and can even extract and manipulate some of the layers. So if it is more like a 3D painting, and then share things very easily for others to try it out if they have an AR device as well. So let's not overhype it, because this is a promotional video. If we want to be very honest, what you can do in Adobe Aero is very limited in terms of interactivity, but it's primarily a very basic immersive authoring tool. It comes with a desktop application as well, actually. Adobe Aero supports touch-based interaction on the iPad, and you can bring in some of your own assets, and then some basic interactions like animations and clicking an object can be detected, for example. So I'm gonna go over that video because I just showed that to you. Reality Composer from Apple is actually, I think of these tools as synonyms because they actually, none of them is more powerful than the other. They both have support for creating 3D scenes, dragging and dropping elements into 3D or into AR. They both have AR modes that you can enable or disable, and adding simple interactivity. Obviously, because they are AR tools, you can actually author content that is anchored in the real world. And that is actually the most fun part of immersive authoring. So it allows you to, it's very powerful at getting the scale right and maybe think through some of the interactions at that scale, even though you may not be able to fully implement them with this tool. So Reality Composer is very similar. So let's skip this video. I want to go to tools that are more on the VR side. So Maquette, Microsoft Maquette, in my opinion, is one of the more sophisticated, it'll look more like UIs rather than 3D sketches, what you get out of it. And you can export from Maquette to Unity. And in Maquette, you also have some very basic support for scripting. So it'll, you can do scripting like this through some of their click and play visual kind of like scripts, or you can load scripts in Maquette from, for example, here we have a relatively basic script on the right that puts an object in front of the user at a certain scale and color. And that is like, if that is the interaction you wanted to implement, so the user can spawn an object, you could actually do that lightweight scripting. I did have a video on Maquette. Maybe Mark showed that already because we had Maquette introduced earlier. Where I was in Maquette, I'm not sure whether Mark played it. Anybody here remember? Probably Mark did show it. So if you wanted to see Maquette in action, I would normally give a live demo, but we kept it a little shorter and easier here for today. So anyway, if you wanted to see Maquette, I can show that again. The last thing I wanted to say is, while we expand more on Unity in the next few slides, there's a form of prototyping that I think is very powerful in some sense and still doesn't give you more interactivity in another. But we call this piggyback prototyping, which is the idea of really creating a prototype on top of an existing application. Many applications now, like many social VR applications, for example, have creator tools. So examples of that are obviously Snapchat, and I'll show you an example. And then Mozilla Spoke and Hubs, Minecraft, VR and AR, and Rec Room Creator Kit. I wanted to show you some of these examples. There are more, but the point is that you would actually benefit from the existing social platform and user base, and the whole networking aspect to it. So I was just coming back from my student presentations, and the student did in fact prototype their VR karaoke experience using Mozilla Hubs and Spoke, and then actually was able to invite some of his friends and give him feedback on the VR karaoke experience that he prototyped because people were able to join. So here I show an example of us prototyping for a local museum. This is a student project from Anna Cardenas here, who's now a PhD student at UCLA. And so what we did here, I mean, it's cool. It's a bunch of different lenses. We took an original museum art piece that was there and enriched it through Snapchat lenses by allowing you to zoom into some of the elements that the artist had created, and we created additional lenses on top so you could see the sun move in interesting ways. And we tried out a few different lenses. The main point of the piggyback prototyping approach is we actually published some of our lenses and we had 122,000 views within a week. People actually used and scanned it and shared almost 5,000 times within 1 week. So, I mean, it's a very different scale of prototyping. Plus, you can actually get feedback. The way we popularized it was also through Reddit. We really wanted to go a little bit more crazy in how to reach and get feedback on our prototypes. ultimately, this was designed for a local museum. So the lenses we created, while they are fun in itself, they were really designed for the context of the museum. And so the feedback that we got from our online Snapchat users was obviously needed to be separated from any feedback we got from our students and visitors in the museum. Anyway, if you wanted to learn more about this, Anna wrote a nice little Medium article on, and I always like to share that with students and people and educators. And if you run design workshops, because it's actually a really fun write-up on how and how a student used a tool like Snapchat and the experiences they had through piggyback prototyping. Mozilla Hubs is a tool where maybe you've experienced it through some virtual conferences. You can create scenes for Mozilla Hubs. So it's a social VR experience. And Spoke is the tool that you would use to create the content, link up videos and audio sources. And in some sense, it's actually a prototyping tool for a social VR experience, like the VR karaoke example that I gave you earlier from one of my students. Also, Minecraft has both support for VR and AR. This is a little bit of the story behind Minecraft VR and how John Carmack actually approached them and wanted Minecraft in VR. And so it's a little bit of an interview style, but it is interesting how they actually make Minecraft experiences possible in VR, including full manipulation. And there are people on YouTube who recreated their apartment, for example, prototyped their apartment in VR using Minecraft. Pretty fun. And my last example is Rec Room. A student at Stanford pointed that out to me just last week when I was visiting them. I personally haven't spent a lot of time in Rec Room. It's again a social VR experience. And they have maker tools, which I think is something we might benefit. So if you were to prototype a social VR experience, a multi-user VR experience, I don't think you would have a lot of luck prototyping things quickly in Unity, because you can focus on the single user experience, but then you would require a lot of programming making it multi-user. And here in this video, they just go through all the tools that allow you to immersively prototype and decorate the room. So you could imagine setting up a VR experiment in there and then bringing in participants and then thinking about how you would monitor and do a user study in there, for example. But you would have this prototype relatively quickly. You can also import assets, so you don't have to do it the way they show it here. I think it's interesting to consider that prototyping doesn't necessarily have to happen in some of the standard tools. So for the remaining time, I want to go through the development process and just outline a few different toolkits to really wrap up the development and testing part. So far, you can still prototype within Unity and Unreal, but increasingly will hit a higher learning curve. And you would actually then, I think of these tools more of like, this is where I do my final digital prototype, and it really then I develop it into that experience that I want to deploy on any of these headsets. So, and when I choose a tool, I always think about the background that people have. And if you have a web dev background, a game dev background, or mobile dev background, this really depends which ones you will find easier to access and work with. WebEx are very straightforward if you have a web development background. Unity is a bit harder, but ultimately it's a win because you will be able to reach a lot more users potentially and devices, even though WebXR support is pretty good. As a game developer, the tool of choice is most likely Unity or Unreal. You're less likely to work natively with SDKs. If you have mobile dev experience, you may even have used Unity in the past just to create 2D mobile experience, then obviously it's not too much of a jump. It's just using a different toolkit behind and platform that you would deploy to. So as a mobile developer, you would find Unity or working directly with the native SDKs is something you would be very familiar with because it's something you are used to. When it comes to mobile dev, you either go cross-platform through like PhoneGap or Cordova kind of style approaches in there. I don't even know what the latest toolkits are, but there are a lot of these that abstract away from the mobile experiences. And then for Unity, we also have some of these tools like AR Foundation. So what I want to do is a quick overview of some of the more development tools we have. So A-Frame was most likely previously mentioned. So it's like web-based authoring, new HTML tags. Here's a scene where you create a basic 3D scene that runs in the browser. So I'll just open it here. It's interactive in the browser. You can walk around, look at it. And if I have a VR headset connected, all I would have to do is press the VR button and then put on my headset and experience that in VR. And this was created with just a few lines of code. Here, let me load this. 1 second. Okay. Here is a few A tags, a box, a sphere, a cylinder, a plane that we put inside the scene, and we have a gray background. And obviously now it's 3D positioning, so you have 3 coordinates, X, Y, Z, and then it is, you don't use CSS directly. It's like a little bit more old school, where you mix presentation and format a little bit when it comes to A-Frame. But interactivity is then in a layer through JavaScript. And so I would have an example of how to create a very basic 360 scene in A-Frame and in Unity. I will actually very quickly go through this just for the sake of, actually, I will probably skip this, and I want to go through some of the more toolkits. So Unity was mentioned. I just want to show that one then. So Unity is a very powerful tool. Started out as a game engine, has integrated support now for XR apps, VR previews, and all that kind of stuff. It's a powerful scene editor, asset management, and store. So you have access to the asset store, which actually gives you access to a lot of free 3D models. So very quickly you can populate your scenes. Basically all XR device vendors actually support Unity. So when you are in A-Frame or Unity, I want to get to the point where we look at I would have more to say about differences between A-Frame and Unity and Unreal. And if there are questions, we can talk about that. But in terms of XR platforms and toolkits that you have access to, you need to think about whether you want to develop for VR or for AR. It's not always important to distinguish, because A-Frame, for example, supports both VR and AR, and Unity also. But then it comes down to really different kinds of toolkits and libraries that you would use. So Steam VR is something that is available in Unity, and pretty popular platform, game distribution platform. Steam has also a lot of the games on Steam support Steam VR, and it has a lot of basic VR interactions that you can access. MRTK, Mixed Reality Toolkit, is a toolkit that is now more or less true mixed reality in some sense. So you can, it started out as a toolkit for HoloLens. It was actually called Holo Toolkit initially, and then it became more cross-platform, and now it can even support Oculus VR devices. So I'll show you an example of Mixed Reality Toolkit. Within Unity, you would build on XR Interaction Toolkit. This is really if you want to stay native to Unity, if you will. And then you could also use some of the more device-specific SDKs. On the AR side, I would distinguish between marker-based and marker-less. So depending on what I need to prototype or implement, if it's a marker-based experience, I'll show you an example of ARJS. This is a toolkit that would be you could run it on top of A-Frame or 3JS directly, which is the layer below A-Frame, if you will, as a WebGL layer. Vuforia, which is marker-based, it comes with a studio that I showed earlier. Vuforia Studio is more like click and play tool, but Vuforia in itself is more like a library for Unity that you could import. It's a package, and then it supports marker-based AR. I'll also show you that. And so let's look at some of these examples. What is important, again, at the highest level is distinguishing some of these main XR platforms. I'll focus more on WebXR, so using A-Frame, for example, and Unity in the next few slides. And I wanted to show you some of the examples of the different toolkits. But what is important, and you might find this a bit tedious, but it is unfortunately still the case, that the toolkit really determines which of the devices you can actually reach. And so for each of the toolkits, I'll show you, okay, so A-Frame, for example, you can create WebXR experiences and you can reach Cardboard, Oculus, Vive, Windows Mixed Reality, and AR Core, not so much ARKit. So any kind of Apple iPhone user would have a very hard time seeing or experiencing an A-Frame AR marker, less AR prototype at least. So ARJS you may be able to get to work. So A-Frame, I just showed the scene before. I said to you at the press of a button, you could experience it in VR. And here's an interactive version of that scene. It is actually running directly in the browser. It's then rendered to my headset. The browser that I would use normally is either Firefox on a desktop. Google Chrome has increasing support, but I still struggle to get it to work. So with Firefox and Mozilla's Firefox, I have no problem running an A-Frame experience directly in the browser and then rendering on my headset, or I go on my Oculus device. I use the Oculus browser. The Oculus browser on the Oculus Quest has advanced support for WebXR. And if I wanted to do ARJS, which is marker-based AR, it's very easy to create an experience like this. So here we have an AR toolkit based marker, the hero marker. And here I see the same A-Frame scene I just showed you in VR. I see it in AR. It's actually superimposed on the marker when the marker is detected. You can configure ARJS so that tracking, so that the object may disappear if tracking is lost, or you could actually make it a smoother experience, because it's very likely that the user will lose the marker and the tracking, and then it would be a very disruptive experience, as you just see it here. On the more advanced toolkits side, we have SteamVR. Here's an example scene in SteamVR. A lot of the interactions that you see here are just very easy to recreate. This is the interactions example. So you have teleporting zones. You can give visual feedback if teleporting is allowed or not. And then I think at some stage, maybe the most interesting part is when I actually play with the bow and arrow or the remote car. So you have some remote control over this car here with a little bit of scripting. It's actually cool to play with a remote control car in VR. And then finally, the most fun experience here is bow and arrow and actually hitting a target, which I think I missed all of them. Too bad. I'm pretty sure there was a portion in this video recording where I actually hit some of the targets. So SteamVR comes with a lot of support for some of these interactions that do not necessarily require programming. Mixed Reality Toolkit is a toolkit I've been using a lot in our work on that often involves the HoloLens. So here you see their interactions example. Each of these elements you can attach behaviors to them so that they can be, for example, manipulated through near or far interaction, or have zooming metaphors in there, and can have interactive keyboard. So HoloLens 2 has full finger tracking, fully articulated hand tracking. And here we just support the index finger in this one example, but you could do more. And so it comes with standard widgets, which I think is sometimes, so like these sliders is something you can have and need to think about where you would put them in your interface, but it's very easy to prototype. So it's like a widget library that comes with it, and the interactions with each of the widgets are supported. And then you can attach behaviors to objects, including physics and rescaling at the common pinch to zoom kind of interactions. And thank you, Laura. It was nice to see you and nice to have you here in the tutorial. Yeah, it would have been fun to meet. Have fun. Thanks for coming. So Vuforia is a toolkit to get you started marker-based AR interactions. So here's a scene, an example scene in Vuforia, where you would place an object on a marker and then actually bring it to life. As you play the scene, you would, this is for an ISMA audience, it's probably some of the really basic stuff, but I mean, for prototyping, it can actually be really powerful. Marker-based interactions allow me to prototype more advanced behaviors, but having full control over the interactions using physical markers. Like, that's why I still think marker-based AR has a big place in at least prototyping, and some of these interactions I could then actually implement and prototype more fully in a different tool. So I want to show two more examples. Another starting point could be, and maybe let me show this slide first. So AR Foundation is only in Unity, but is actually abstracts from both ARCore and ARKit. I mentioned that before. And so it comes with basic behaviors and some, for example, here detects zones, so surfaces where you can actually place objects. And then I can have very quickly, I can add drag and drop interactions or pinch to scale. And that is actually not difficult to implement. It's just a behavior you need to attach to the 3D model you want, and the 3D model needs to have a collider, so it needs to be able to detect collision, including when you touch onto the screen here. It's very important to realize that touch is different in 3D. We would actually, from the touch point, shoot a laser ray cast into the scene and detect where the object is hit, and then support some of these interactions. Which is then really just a matter of attaching behavior to some behaviors, so just components in Unity to some of these. Final example here is XR Interaction Toolkit, which supports interactions in both AR and VR. So here is a lot of teleporting, and then we can also pick up objects and interact with them, and they can be animated. And you have different kinds of grab interactions and near and far manipulation. So near means the user actually has to collide with the object. Far is the user would just point at the object, and sometimes they snap onto the device, and you have physics. And so this is a far interaction here. So support for all of these interactions is available in all these toolkits. So this was a quick overview of the landscape of some of these tools. And I want to kind of like put everything together in this last slide. What have we learned today? And maybe not everything was new to you, but maybe we completed some of the, if there were any gaps in your overview of XR tools. So on the VR toolbox side, we've talked about how to get from 2D to 3D, and discussed a lot of the digital authoring tools and immersive authoring tools. When it comes for designing for VR experiences, I think what I would focus on when I prototype is really the environmental design. The lights, the shadows, the animations can make a big difference. Spatial sound is something you can do in a lot of the tools relatively easily, drag and drop. And then I introduced you to, it was relatively quick, an overview of toolkits with support for some of the basic VR interactions like teleporting and object manipulation as some of more advanced VR interactions. So prototyping a menu in VR is, interestingly, still one of the most difficult things to do with most toolkits. Luckily, I think VR menus are overrated and we shouldn't actually have too many of them. I think VR design shouldn't be primarily menu driven. And so whenever you feel like you need a menu, you should think about whether there are other means to do it, because the point of prototyping VR and AR experiences is not to just put 2D screen elements into the 3D world. Coming back to what I said initially about the story and the context that we want to prototype for. On the, I think of, and actually Mark is teaching his courses in both the order that I was teaching it, coming from VR and then into AR. And then this year, I think Mark swapped it the other way around, actually introducing his students more to AR first and then adding VR. So there's a lot of similarity between prototyping and developing and designing for VR and AR, but AR really adds you need to really think about what kind of AR device do we have? So it's not just a matter of does it support, how big is the field of view, or does it support this or that, but fundamentally, can it actually track the environment? And or should we use marker-based AR? And so I think you design quite differently for marker-based AR experience, where you really have to keep in mind that the user has to keep the marker in view. And I showed you some tools for marker-based AR prototyping, including Vuforia, and then marker-less AR prototyping, and even some of the more advanced marker-less interactions, where I think XR Interaction Toolkit from Unity, so on top of Unity, or Mixed Reality Toolkit from Microsoft primarily, but actually works across devices, not just the HoloLens. And even outside of Unity, there is a port to Unreal for Mixed Reality Toolkit, and integration with Figma as a low fidelity digital prototyping tool when it comes to AR experiences. So it's integration with Mixed Reality Toolkit. So I think these are some of the main takeaways. So Mark, we have you back. So we could think about wrapping up and maybe talking about some of the research directions in our last element. So, and then I'll also answer if there are any questions, but in the last 15 minutes, I thought we could talk quickly about some of the research directions. So when, and Mark, I invite you a comment here. So when I was looking at the ISMAR program, was obviously lots of cool stuff. The closing ceremony yesterday, it was nice to see Kinect Fusion being recognized as a very impactful research, and it is obviously. And then the contributions this year, as far as they relate to our prototyping course, I picked a few. I like it when we have work that allows us to organize interaction techniques into kind of like a taxonomy, and that really is also, it's very useful to know what kinds of interactions have previously been implemented and how to implement them. And so don't reinvent the wheel. Let's look at existing interaction techniques. So this kind of work is very helpful for us. Then I think right now, when it comes to prototyping, the part that we haven't emphasized sufficiently is like how prototyping, especially the immersive authoring tools, allow you to involve users. But ultimately you need user testing. And so I find it very interesting when we have work that looks at the pitfalls and potentials of, for example, doing remote experiments in VR. So I thought it was relevant to us here as well. And then any kind of 3D object manipulation and collaboration. I find collaborative authoring is very important. And then on the ethics side, I wish that as we prototype things, we already think about the ethical considerations, and we actually lack actually a lot of the guidance and framework. So I really appreciate work here from friends Mark McGill, Mohamed Khamis, and Julie Williamson on safety, power imbalances, ethics, process, and really thinking about how to design safer experiences for both VR users and bystanders. So more relevant, if we zoom in again onto the prototyping research directions, I think some of the hard parts are still making the transition from physical to digital. So we showed you some tools like POP, and then some of my own research. Interactive prototyping, so really the prototyping interactivity without programming. So for example, Wizard of Oz. We still see quite some cool research coming out of Autodesk or Adobe, primarily in the human-computer interaction. So CHI conference or WIST. I'm currently co-chairing WIST. WIST is next week. So I'm looking forward maybe seeing some of you at WIST. On-device, cross-device, immersive authoring. I still personally am very intrigued by the questions. What is immersive authoring actually good for, and when is it too limiting, and when it is actually really more powerful than what we can do on the desktop? I think these need to go hand in hand, and so I appreciate it if tools of the future support more integration of the rapid transition to a device, an on-device, but then also back to the desktop, where I really have full control and can kind of like author in third person and then jump into first person to experience it. Visual scripting and asset code generation, I think is, I haven't actually seen a tool yet that generates a VR experience from a sketch. Most UI generation research is always driven by this vision, and so I think I've seen a lot of immersive authoring and increasing the visual scripting tools, but I think there is really potential to onboard novice designers and especially build guidelines into the tools. So it's very easy to get somebody to do something, but I think the actual research directions should include guiding our novice designers and creators, and then finally collaborative authoring, which I think we have seen some elements in ISMAR, and it's been I showed you the EXA director work, the Disney work initially, and to me these are some of the promising research directions. I wonder, Mark, how do you think about the space, and is there still a need for more prototyping tools, research, and methods?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. I stopped sharing for a second so we can see you better.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think there's definitely tools, need a lot more prototyping tools, especially ones that you can design from within the application. So, for example, prototyping from within inside AR or VR and authoring from within the application. I think there's a lot of need for the tools there.
Right. Cool. So I'm wondering, I mean, this was our tutorial. I mean, we could expand on some things. We had to cut some corners here and there, but overall, I think it's pretty complete. I'm wondering whether we have any questions from our remaining attendees, anything you want us to expand on in these last few minutes. Because this is a webinar, I think you would have to type it in the chat if you had questions. So some of our participants, Mark, had to leave, but they sent a quick message I thought was very nice.
That's great.
It was interesting to hear about prototyping strategy and how to think it through. Sorry, I didn't see your part. I like the case studies that you usually show because they allow us to think through the abstract things a little bit more concretely based on a case study. Really nice. Thank you very much. Okay, Andrea, thank you very much then. It was nice to have you here. It would have been great to in person, right? So, all right. Well then, Mark, this concludes a week of ISMAR for you. I couldn't actually attend too much. Did you see some new things yourself this week that maybe we should incorporate in future versions of this tutorial? How do you think about some of the content that was presented this week?
Oh, there was a lot that was really great. Didn't see too much we can put in the tutorial, but we had some really good keynote speeches, especially from, I've forgotten the name of the lady from Microsoft, but she did some really nice work on haptics that she talked about.
Was it Mar? I think it was Mar, right?
That's
Mar
right.
Gonzalez?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, she's really good. And then some of the perceptual papers I found really interesting as well. There weren't many papers, as far as I could tell, that related to authoring or prototyping, but it was just good to see the state of the art of the rest of the research kind of getting better and better.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's nice, and it's nice to see that and hear from you, Mark, who have been so active for so long, to still get a lot out of this conference and then tell us like some pointers to the program. So thank you for that.
No problem.
All right, is there some things you wanted to say to wrap up, Mark?
Oh, just thank everybody for coming, and then there'll be a recording made of this, of course, but if anybody wants any of the content, then please contact us and we can get copies of some of the slides that you've had as well. And we'll be doing a version of this again at the SIGGRAPH Asia conference coming up in December. So if you have any friends or others or students that you think would like to benefit from this, please look out for that. And I think that's about it, really. Thanks everybody for participating.
Right. Okay, yeah, cool.
Michael, do you have anything?
We have Mark is maintaining a website on prototyping, exa-prototyping.org, that has some of the materials. And there is a question actually.
Question, yeah, sure. You can talk about it, Michael. It's okay.
Sorry, what?
there's a question that just popped up if you want to answer.
Yeah, let me
question.
just, so just one more reference if you wanted. Obviously, Mark shares a lot of his lectures online as well. And so it's great to have him. I have an online course that goes over a lot of the prototyping stuff as well, and happy to share materials with if there are any instructors in the audience. And then I think finally the Mark said, please contact us. I wanted to show this. Where do we have I thought we had one where you could contact, here, sorry, this one. So this would be the way to contact us. And so there's a question from Alejandro. Do you think at this point we are lacking of more platforms for rapid prototyping, or do you think we need better user interfaces to design in 3D? Interesting. So, I mean, for me, it's both. I actually think we are still lacking of good guidelines and tools that guide us through the design. We do have quite a bit of platforms and tools for rapid prototyping, but it's not always obvious how to make the best use of them. So I feel like it's a little bit of both. That would be my answer to your question. What do you think, Mark?
Looking at the question here. Yeah, I think I think we have a good number of platforms ready for rapid prototyping. I think we do probably need better user interfaces for designing in 3D, especially being able to do add to more complicated behaviors or do more interactive design. I think is lacking right now. So there are many tools that will allow us to, like a Microsoft Marquette, where you can drag and drop and create 3D interfaces in 3D, but there are not so many that allow you to add behaviors or more complicated interactions from within the 3D environment itself. So I think there's a need for there as well. Yeah, and then part of it also, I think, is people aren't aware of what tools are already out there. So hopefully the workshops like this will help make raise the visibility of the different tools that are available.
Right. Cool. Okay, so I think we are through the content then, right, Mark?
Yep, that's all good. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Great. Okay.
Thanks for coming.
We'll see you later. Thanks everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.